Thank you so much for joining us here today. I wanted to officially welcome you to the Ministry of Housing, Real Estate Fundamentals for Houses of Worship. Yes, awesome. Thank you. Round of applause. I'll take it. So my name is LJ Jennings. I am with DCG Strategies. And DCG Strategies, we are honored to host today's event. We are also honored to co-host our event today with the San Francisco Interfaith Council. So please give them a round of applause as well, too. Unfortunately, Michael Pappas, who most of you may probably know in this room, who is the executive director, he was unable to join us last minute. But Michael does send his welcome and his well wishes to all of you. And so before we get started, just wanted to give you a brief history of how we got here and who our company is. So DCG Strategies, we've been around since 2005, so almost 20 years next year, and we specialize in working with faith-based communities. Our company was really birthed out of a need. Our CEO and founder, Landis Graydon, who unfortunately was unable to join, so I'm taking his place on today, his pastor actually was a bishop of his local congregation. And the bishop would have all of his local pastors calling him saying, hey, I need a real estate agent who I can trust, who speaks my language, and who understands how ministry works. Who can you refer me to? And the bishop would say, call Landis, call Landis, call Landis. And that really, truly is how DCG Strategies was born. We are a ministry. We are a faith-based entity in and of ourselves. Most of our team and our senior leaders, we are faith-based as well, too. And so we're honored to have you here and honored to be here. Also, too, a little bit about how did this come into place, right? Ministry of Housing, how did this come to be? This truly was also birthed out of a need. And so in our day-to-day working with congregations and houses of worship throughout the state of California, a lot of our current clients as well as prospective clients would call us and say, hey, we know there's a housing crisis. I think everybody knows in California we're a housing crisis. We have underutilized land. We have vacant land. What can we do to help support our communities? And oftentimes we want to help support our staff because our staff cannot afford to live in our community as well. And so that coupled with a lot of conversation and all the buzz with all the new legislation, right? I'm sure we've all heard SB4. We were getting a lot of phone calls saying, what is this? What does it mean? I know they're saying faith-based communities. I know they're saying nonprofits, but how does it apply to me? Does it apply to me? And how can I use it towards my advantage? And so today's event was really birthed out of DCG strategy, and our team really wanting to demystify the development process. I will say development is a really intense and long process, so we are not trying to oversimplify it at all. There's also no way that we can teach you everything there is to know about development in a short half-day conference and conversation. However, our goal is to really equip you as houses of worship to join in and take part in the development process if that is something that you and your congregation have decided that this is something that we want to partake in. And so we have assembled an amazing lineup of speakers that will be presenting here today. And our hope is to really walk you through the process from vision to reality, right? I have a piece of land. I have this idea. I don't know what to do. I don't know where to start. How do I make this a reality? Or even, is this right for me? Is my land even feasible for development? So we're going to talk through a lot of those different options on today. As I said, we are honored to co-host today's event with San Francisco Interfaith Council. And last but certainly not least, today's program, this total event, this is the first of two conferences, as you may or may not be aware. We have our second conference that we're hosting in Hayward on February 15th, as well as we are providing pre-development grant funding, which we'll share a little bit more about later in today's program. But all of this would not be possible without the generous support of the San Francisco Foundation. We are so honored to partner with San Francisco Foundation, and we really appreciate and thank San Francisco Foundation for their support of our community, for for their support of this initiative and their support of houses of worship. And so we are joined today by Michelle Chambers, who is the director of the Faith Program with San Francisco Foundation. And so in a second, I'd like to invite Michelle up just to share a few words. And then immediately following Michelle, Megan MacGyver, who's on the DCG strategy team, will come up after Michelle, and we'll jump right into our first session. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Michelle.
Thank you. Grand Rising, everyone. Well, actually, Lauren covered everything. I had all these notes. I left my original notebook on the bus because I was so really great, and I did public transportation this morning. Then I had these notes, and then she took them all away. Thanks, Lauren. So, first of all, thank you guys for getting up early, coming out, and really, having a full commitment of solving the issue of housing, that you are committed to bringing low-income housing and affordable housing to our community members who are unhoused currently now, or who pay 80% of what they earn for housing, and they have to make these hard decisions on, well, am I going to buy groceries, or do I need a roof over my head? If you don't have a place to call home, you really can't do anything else, y'all. It's hard. You need to have a place to call home. And so the faith community has always been committed to solving what are the ills and the issues in the community. And so why not have philanthropy invest in that? And that's where the Faith Program comes from. I bring you greetings from our trustees and our CEO, Fred Blackwell, at the San Francisco Foundation. The FAITHS program, its acronyms FAITHS, it stands for Foundation Alliance with Interfaith to Heal Society. Pastor Brown here at Third Baptist Church and Pastor J. Alfred Smith came to our then CEO, which was in 1992, and said, you all need to do something to assist the faith community, because we are in neighborhoods and we're supporting neighborhoods before the government entities get there. When there is a crisis in the neighborhood, who do people call? Not Ghostbusters. They call houses of worship. No matter what their spiritual pathway is, they're gonna go where there is gonna be a container and a community of care and belonging, and some love and some empathy to help them through whatever crisis they are. And that is the faith community, that is us. And so why not have the philanthropic sector support us? And so that was really the big bridge building of what is now the FAITHS program. And from 1992, we started in 1993. And our program officer, Brother Joe Brooks, which I wanna just stop and pause here. We lost our fearless father of faiths yesterday morning. He has transitioned, so you all pray for his family, pray for us at the faith staff, because he was very much still committed to helping us, although he had left the program and went on to do bigger and better things at PolicyLink on a global basis. But he was still very much a part of who we are at Faith, so definitely pray for them. But Brother Joe Brooks decided that he was the program officer of the Neighborhood and Community Development Program, and he decided, well, we're gonna do, they went across the 5 Bay Area county and they interviewed 600 folks in the faith community. And that's how they came up with the name FAITHS and its acronyms and what we're supposed to do. And so really what we do is we help build the capacity of faith-based organizations and congregations in our 5 Bay Area counties. We serve Alameda County, Contra Costa County, Marin County, San Mateo County, and San Francisco County. Now, because housing is a big crisis and we're all in on housing, we have expanded our work in the housing. So we're actually serving the 9 Bay Area counties for our housing crisis, because we all know that folks are having to move out further for affordability. And so now those particular areas are having the same issues and strains that we're having here in the urban core. Now, really when this started, this was in, I want to say I met Landis and Lauren. They're a team. You know, if there's no Landis, there's no Lauren. If there's no Lauren, there's no Landis. I always saw them both together, and we had all of our meetings together. But I think that was in 2006 when we first started this this conversation of how can we assist each other to really bring a full spectrum of opportunities. Oh, somebody turn off my phone. That's 10 o'clock. My husband's supposed to take his he's supposed to take his medicine. Yeah, just push the button. Thank you. Thank you so much. He's supposed to take his medication. My husband had a transplant, and so I have to remind him, those of us who are wives, you know what I'm talking about. I have to remind him to take his transplant medication at 10 o'clock. So really, we started this conversation around housing. I want to say that the faith community is no stranger to housing. We came up and we stepped up to the plate when there was an issue with senior housing. How many of your congregations you guys know congregations who have senior housing? Raise your hands. Okay, so it's no issue. So what we're doing right now is we are really trying to put, not a Band-Aid, but we're trying to create, I'm not a builder, but I want to say, not sheetrock, that's what I want to say. We're trying to put the sheetrock on the walls in the house with the work that we're doing in these trainings that we're doing. And we really need you all to share this information and let your other faith-based organizations and groups in your network know where we are. If anybody needs my card, you can have my card. But we want you guys to share this information with everyone, because what I don't like to hear is, I don't want to continue to receive calls from congregations and say, I'm in relationship with a developer and I'm not sure if this is a great deal for me, because I first start saying, well, what's your split with developer fees? And they say 0. Well, how did you do your land lease? And they say, what land lease? We gave them the land. I don't want to continue to hear those calls, which is why we're having this series here. But the only way that we can stop continuing to hear those calls is that you guys share this information and these resources that we have. So there is a conduit for folks to come to at the FACE program with DCG to do this work. Again, I want to thank DCG. I want to thank San Francisco Interfaith Council, Michael and Cynthia. I want to thank St. Mark's. I just want to thank all of you guys for just sharing this with us and showing us love and showing up. So thank you so much.
Welcome, my name is Megan MacIver, and I am Vice President at DCG Strategies. I am also a candidate for ordination in the ELCA, and I've been part of, thank you. And I've been part of the wonderful, vibrant life here at St. Mark's Lutheran Church for about 2 years now. Most field ed students stay 4 months, and I just could never leave because I am in love with this place. I'm in love with these people, and I'm in love with what's happening here. So we're going to hear a lot about St. Mark's Square, which is a development that's happening right out here. But just welcome, we're thrilled you're here. And so I'm just going to get started. I'm going to take my seat, actually. So, great. Well, with that said, I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves. Shannon, would you like to start?
Great. Can we hear me? Okay. I'm Shannon Chang. I'm the president of the Board of Trustees here at St. Mark's Square. So I'd like to welcome you all to the square. As we talk especially about ownership of land today, I do want to acknowledge that St. Mark's Square sits on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone. Our congregation has a living land acknowledgement. We're committed to ongoing education and restoring right relationships with Indigenous people. We'll be doing tours of the square afterwards. Part of the tour, if you go on one, you'll see our mural out there, which was done by Jane Kim from Inkwell. And that's also part of our land acknowledgement. It's a living, tells a story of urbanization and native species with a message of hope. So please do take a look at the mural when you're outside later today. So St. Mark's Square, we're to talk a little bit about the mission and vision. Our mission, we're a separate nonprofit from the church, but our mission is to support the ministries of St. Mark's Lutheran Church with an emphasis on older and vulnerable populations, specifically with housing and services. So that's our mission, paraphrasing it. It goes back to the 60s when our nonprofit was incorporated. And our vision really is ultimately, we have one tower of housing now, 121 units of affordable senior housing. We're working on a development right behind us that will be 94 units of senior housing. And then we have a vision for the future of family housing in the parcel next door. So ultimately, our vision is to have an interfaith, intergenerational campus anchored by St. Mark's Lutheran Church with over 300 units of affordable housing for the community.
Great. And Phil?
Wow. My name is, that's amazing. My name is Phil Brochard. I serve as the rector or the priest with responsibility at All Souls Episcopal Parish, which is in Berkeley on the north side of the Cal campus. And I think I'm here because about 9 years ago now, we started down this path to consider building affordable housing at All Souls. And it resulted in Jordan Court, which is a 34-unit housing for elders, and 12 of those are set aside for elders who have been living on the streets with serious mental illness and now have found their way into permanent housing. And I'm just really grateful for what we've experienced over time, not just with the process of, I love that, thank you Lauren, birthing the housing, but also with how it's become integrated into the life of our congregation. And so I'm really eager to talk about what it's like, not just to build, but to live and talk about that because it's been profound. And also has realized that having made it around that corner, we're really eager to be able to share the fruits of our experience and see what we can do to make sure that we don't let the door close behind us.
Great. Christina?
Great. Christina Alvarez. I'm the Executive Director of Episcopal Impact Fund. Thank you to DCG and to Michael, who I'm sorry is not here, Meg, for inviting us to be a part of this today. There's lots of us from the Episcopal Impact Fund in the room if you would like to talk to somebody. Michelle, who you just met, is our board chair. Kieran King here is our Director of Communications. Tricia, who just stepped out, is also on the board of directors. So it's really nice to see a lot of familiar faces in the room. So thank you for having us. Episcopal Impact Fund is a philanthropic organization, a nonprofit organization. We are the outreach arm of the Episcopal Diocese of California. So within this role, we have, our job is really to harness like the time, the talent, the treasure of this beautiful community towards bettering our community. Much of our efforts are towards bringing together the resources and the social capital that we have towards building housing security for folks who don't have it. That is really the main thrust of our work. And so within that, we have four pillars that kind of guide our days, our work. We are a grant maker, so we do a lot of grant making within to nonprofit organizations who are resolving and ending homelessness for folks or preventing homelessness for folks. So it's a lot of funding to exactly this, organizations who are really confronting housing insecurity straight on. We also work within advocacy, so addressing the systemic causes of that housing insecurity. So we're trying to go upstream. We're not only looking at populations that are currently homeless, but really looking at prevention work and how do we change the flow of folks to the streets. Also volunteerism, we practice what's called trust-based philanthropy, which is for an entirely different day and panel, but trust-based philanthropy is really a deep investment in and really relationship with the nonprofit organizations that we fund. So we really are, we talk a lot at the Impact Fund that we're really interested in where the church and streets interact. That's where our call is to the churches and the streets. We're very practical. And so we are in it with the nonprofits that we fund. And so if there's things to be done, we're gonna be there doing the things with them. That's kind of our philosophy of funding. So volunteerism is a thrust of one of our pillars. And then we also spend a lot of time in exactly the space that we're here to discuss, which is faith-based affordable housing. And we'll get into those details later, but we work in deep partnership with churches within the Episcopal Diocese and with the diocese itself on finding, kind of trying to do what Phil did at All Souls, right? But for other models of congregations. So we'll talk more about that later.
Great. And Pastor Stacy.
Yes. Good morning.
Good morning.
God is good.
God is good.
And all the time. God is good. I'm Pastor Stacy Current. I'm currently the pastor of Temple United Methodist Church. All the Methodists in the room, give me a little shout out. I'm honored to be here. I've been working with DCG for maybe the last 10 years. I came to know DCG through my work in my former role I was the district superintendent for the Bay District for the last 8 years, and had opportunity to work with DCG around a lot of projects and a lot of strategy. I've been pastoring in the Bay Area for the past 25 years. Pastored Shattuck Avenue United Methodist Church over in North Oakland, and Jones Memorial over there in the Fillmore, and now over at Temple United Methodist Church. I think the part that I would like to share today is, you know, how it all comes together. I've seen a lot of things that have been tried and not worked. I've seen a lot of visions. I've seen a lot of churches stall and stay stagnant for years. And so I think the space that I would like to speak into today is really, how do we decide as congregations, how do we know if this is the time that God is calling us to do this? And is it worth it? Is it worth it? How many of you know Keith Lee? He's a food blogger.
Oh, yeah.
If you were watching the news last week, you know Keith Lee. He was a food blogger who used to be a mixed martial artist fighter. And he goes and does like mom and pop shops and tries to do a review and make them famous. Last week, he left the Bay Area early on his food tour. And he left the Bay Area early because he said, all of the people sleeping outside, all of the tents, the RVs, he said the Bay Area is not fit for tourists. He said we are struggling to survive. And to me, that was an indictment on all of us who are communities of faith, who are followers of Jesus, who told us to house and feed and clothe. And so that's why I'm here, because I still have the vision that everyone deserves a home.
I think churches and faith congregations have been involved in doing that type of work for a long time. Things like the Interfaith Homeless Shelter, which is hosted at St. Mark's, food pantries. These are all ministries that I think we're all really familiar with and have historically been part of lives of faith congregations. I think what we're here to explore feels substantively different from that, in that we're talking not about churches raising money for a housing fund. We're actually talking about congregations building housing on properties that are owned by those faith communities. And so what I would like to ask the panel is, you know, in your, and fundamentally the congregations too are being asked to step into different roles that they may never have inhabited before, roles of a developer, you know, just things that congregations have never had to do before. And so I guess my question to the panel today is, in your respective worlds, how do you conceive of the development of housing as a ministry? And why is that important to your faith communities for it to be done in this way, next to the congregation physically, or on the property physically?
So we'll just kind of go in order. So St. Mark's Square, we actually have had housing on our square since the 1960s. So I can't speak to way back when, what made them decide. I know it was tied in with the San Francisco redevelopment, which was a series of problematic policies in the 1950s and 60s with the city displacing mostly African American families from their homes. And there were 2 phases of redevelopment, and basically between the phases, there was a group of a lot of faith-based organizations, that Black churches in the Fillmore district, neighborhood organizations, other faith leaders, including the pastor here at St. Mark's at the time, organized labor, a real coalition of the community that went to City Hall and said, okay, we can't stop the redevelopment, but we want some changes, some of the community's needs to be served in this next phase. And so that's how there's a housing cooperative just down the street, St. Francis Housing Cooperative, and that's how we have affordable housing, or why we have affordable housing here from the 60s. And so I think for the congregation, it's always been a part, or dating back almost 50 years, it's been a part of our makeup as a congregation. And I think it really comes from the calling, Jesus' calling to serve your neighbor, to love your neighbor. Especially with our position as an urban congregation, our neighbors quite literally are unhoused neighbors, unhoused residents of the Tenderloin, which is just a block away. And so it's always been something that's been important to us. And over the years, we've been in communication with the congregation, really making sure it's something the congregation also understands and wants. I think They see the benefits that the residents of the tower bring to the life of the square and that relationship. And so I think it's been something that we've seen how beautiful that can be, and we have the gift of having this property. And so I think really thinking about how to best steward it for us as an organization, it is the best, highest and best use of our land would be to provide housing for our neighbors.
I've always looked at St. Mark's and been in awe that this is happening 60 years ago. For us, it's much, much more recent. We had, well, churches don't make great landlords all the time. And we had a relatively derelict building next door to All Souls that in time we took possession of, and we're doing, we had seminarians that lived there, some staff housing, and we were housing folks coming out of the ICE detention center in Richmond who were seeking asylum. And it was really holy, holy work. And that building was really in trouble. And so we knew that what we were doing wasn't going to last for very long. And so one of the things we did is we reached out to the city of Berkeley and said, what do you understand this building's purpose is? And they said, well, you can, think about what you want with that building, but you need to have at least 2 housing units in there with whatever you do next. And so that began for us a period of discernment. And we took a long time to listen, which I think was critical for our path as a congregation, was to really listen. And so that meant listening to what we believe was the workings of God through the people of the congregation. We talked to local elected officials, we talked to local community leaders. And at every step, we were trying to listen for what are we supposed to do next with this. We talked to people in our neighborhood. It was a mixed conversation. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But we understood that we had an opportunity to enter into the life of the city of Berkeley in a way that we hadn't before. And that came with great risk. There's a risk of exposure. And it offered an opportunity to really tap into life. And so for us, it came into conversations with our elected officials. We said, okay, if we're looking to build affordable housing, what kind of affordable housing is most needed in our city? Is it for foster youth? Is it for vets? Is it for families, for elders? What do you see? And they said, yes. Just please build affordable housing. And in a little bit, I'll talk more about kind of more of our process, but at every step, it was about listening. And then when it came time for the conversations about whether or not we were going to build market rate or a mix or affordable, it was the young people in our congregation, the folks in their 20s, who pointed to those same Jesus teachings and said, well, wait a minute. If we're supposed to be caring for those who are most vulnerable, shouldn't we put our money where our mouth is? Shouldn't we be putting our assets in the form of this land and this building towards that? And so then it wasn't just about, yes, it was about development. We learned a lot of new skills that I never wanted to have. But at the same time, it felt really true and right and holy, like we were being swept into this current that was moving, that was of God, and then we could kind of be a part of.
I mean, that's the answer. I feel like that is, I'm sitting between 2 eloquent clergy. I am, not. I am a layperson, but it's this, right? It is the call. Like I think this is an interesting question to which I do not have an intelligent answer, unfortunately. I feel like the gospel calls us to the streets. And from my faith tradition, that's my faith tradition. And we are called towards the most vulnerable. And so we are in the middle of a public health crisis here in San Francisco, in the Bay, right? I mean, we have neighbors who are severely suffering on the streets. And we also have neighbors who are housed who face severe rent burdens of paying well over 50% of their monthly income to pay for basic necessities, right? And so housing and utilities, right? And so I feel like there is not another path forward except to step into this challenge, right? I just feel like it feels like the nature of a call, right? It feels as if this is the only choice of people of faith, is to lean into this. And so for churches who, as we know, are frequently land banks, right, who have this beautiful critical asset where you can have this opportunity to lean in and resolve or prevent homelessness for folks, it seems like there's not another path forward to me. Like, I have trouble with the other path of choosing to say no to that opportunity. It feels like such a blessing and such an opportunity to be able to say yes to neighbors in that way. And a lot of what we do at the Impact Fund is be in conversation with churches who have felt this call, and to say, how do we go from here is dirt to neighbors moving in, right? And what is that path, and how do we define the million meetings in between here and there? I mean, a lot of what we do at the Impact Fund is sit alongside at the table with churches and walk that path with them. The goal, as folks are going to speak to now or later, is that path is a very long one and a very complicated one, and so it does take somewhat faith to acknowledge that someone will eventually move in to housing on these patches of dirt, right? Like, we frequently say, I'm 43 years old, and we frequently say, like, I don't want to qualify for the senior housing when it opens, right? Like, I would like to have the senior housing open for folks who are not me, right? And so, before I can fill out my application and live there in a building that we've advocated for and built. So I really feel like this is the call. We have social capital as congregations. Many of you have physical land that can contribute to this. It just feels like this is the moral and right thing to do.
Amen to everything that's been said. I think one of the problems for our churches is that our churches were designed and built for a world that doesn't exist anymore. And so most of us are dealing with a perfect storm of deferred and delayed maintenance, buildings that are underused, and as the church is evolving, will probably never be used in the same way again. And so we have buildings that are, for many of us, a source of most of our budget. I mean, either the income or the expense, right? Because we have to keep putting money into these buildings that no longer serve the purpose for which they were built, because that world doesn't exist anymore. So then we have spaces that we're landlording, renting out, or unused spaces that aren't even used. And we're just kind of keeping going because we're hoping the world will change and go back to 1950. And it's not going to. And at the same time, we drive down the street and we see people who are unhoused, living outside, or people who are in the winter interfaith shelter who are working full-time jobs but can't afford housing, and we see them as the guests who are sleeping there. And then we walk into some of our churches that are cavernous, full of room, and are empty. If there was a God, I believe there is a God, but if you believe that there is a God, how do you think God feels about our big old empty churches and the people sleeping outside? How would God feel about what we're doing with what we've been given? And so that's the faith-based work.
Thank you. I just want to say how thrilled I am to be here. I'm so excited by these conversations. I do want to also just open a brief parenthesis. I think we're going to shift the entire day back 30 minutes and cut lunch to 30 minutes instead of 1 hour, because this panel was supposed to end now, and I can't do that. So I'm going to keep going, and with that in mind, this question is for Father Phil. Again, I would like to speak with each of you for hours, so I don't know how we're going to do this, but really, we have an audience here today of folks who are interested in starting down this path that you have walked. So what would you say are your biggest lessons learned? I know it was a long process for you, but everything from conversations, preparing the congregation to walk this path with you, to your role as rector, just any of your largest lessons that you'd like to share in 5 minutes.
Right, a
Yeah.
preacher barely draws breath in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But I'll do my best.
Yeah.
So
Or
I guess
10.
the first and most important thing that I learned was you have to be able to believe it deeply and hold it lightly. Because if you don't believe it deeply, you will not persist. And there will be storms, and there will be things that there were so many times that we ran into an obstacle, and it was like, oh, I don't know how we're gonna make it around this. We started this almost 9 years ago. That was pre-SB4, pre-SB 35, pre-County of Alameda A1 bond measure. Those things were not yet even on the horizon when we started into this. We just knew we were being called forward, as was talked about earlier. And so we were just trying to take the next faithful step. And if we held on to it too tightly, whether it was, the population who is going to be living in the building, or how the funding came together, or the timing of it, or the exactness of the design, then we would have crushed it in our own hands. But you have to be able to engage in it. So one of the things we did was, as I said, we talked to stakeholders. We found that we went to the city planning department in the city of Berkeley and said to them, who are the folks who are developers of affordable housing that you have found that you've enjoyed working with? Who show up? Who work with the community instead of just trying to keep them at bay. And so we got a short list there. We were fortunate to have folks in the congregation who had passion for this and some different kinds of expertise, and that doesn't always happen, which is why it's critical to have folks like the Episcopal Impact Fund, like EBHO, like LISC, like the faith folks at the San Francisco Foundation, because you don't need to know everything. But you need to know the people who do.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so you need to have the willingness, the humility to be able to reach out and invite other people in. I have a belief that when you do that, God will lead you to the people who need to be in the room with you. And that was definitely the case for us over time. You have to really know what is essential, because the rest of the stuff is going to change. But you have to know what is your fundament. So for us it was, we were not going to let go of the land itself, recognizing in the end it's actually not our land, but that we wanted to be able to see what's going to happen with that land in the next 200 years that can forward the mission of God. And we're talking about what you said earlier, Christina, is like, this is different work. And Meg, you said this as well. This is different work than what we might be doing usually as congregations. I have never in my life as a priest signed an 88-year lease, which we did to do this, right? Because we leveraged the value of our property at $1 a year for 88 years so that this could be built, and in exchange, the project built out about 1,500 square feet of office space and 2 3-bedroom, 2-bath apartments for our staff use for $1 a year. So that leveraging was what we needed to figure out. What do we absolutely need? Well, we needed staff housing, right? As has been said many times, because our staff couldn't afford to live around there. And so we knew that, and we knew we wanted office space. And so we went to a variety of folks and said, what is possible? And they did the math. To find out, because if it doesn't pencil out, it's not going to be built. And so you have to find out what's most important to your congregation or your place of worship to know what will be possible, because you're going to get into those rooms to negotiate, and you have to know where you're willing to walk. I think the other most important thing is like, let's see, Michelle, earlier you said, I think, that if you don't want congregations to call you and say, and when you ask, how much did you split in the developer fee, they say, what? Well, I wish you'd I wish I had that phone conversation with you 9 years ago, because that was not on our radar. And there's so many things that you can be in conversation with people who know. And you will hear from many of them later today, because that will help set the foundation then for what you do next and next and next. The last thing I will say is that when we started, again, there was the state, the county, and the city had not really understood the level of the crisis that we were in, and that they had a critical role in helping to solve it. So we were the first project in Northern California to take advantage of SB 35, which was signed by Governor Jerry Brown before he left office. But we only did it because we'd made it through the city planning process, through the zoning adjustment board, through the city council, and like unanimously, which if you know anything about Berkeley politics, just doesn't happen. Nobody agrees about everything in the city of Berkeley.
Yeah.
And then some of our wealthy neighbors plunked down the $500 to appeal. And sent us a letter citing air quality, water quality, traffic patterns, et cetera, which is the beginnings of a CEQA lawsuit.
Oh dear.
And so we had to make this fateful decision, and of course it happened like on December 22nd. I had something really important coming up a few days later. And yet there was a tool there to be able to use, and we didn't know what was going to happen, and it turned out to be great. So those are in place now. Take advantage of them, but do it with as much awareness as possible, talking to all the people who can help you in this, and be engaged with your neighborhood. Because as many neighbors as we had, and they were a small minority of our neighborhood, but they were fierce and they were vocal. We also had people at open forums when people would say, and this is a direct quote, I don't want those people to live in our neighborhood. They would say, what do you mean those people in our neighborhood? Sabrina lives on that corner. She's sleeping outside right now. The question is she going to continue to sleep outside, or is she going to be in a safe, warm place that she can call home? And so that's the kind of conversations that we were more and more a part of that were critical to this happening, because we were willing to be in those conversations. I have much more to say, but I think
Thank you. Wow. Well, that leads perfectly into my next question, which is for Pastor Stacy. So as a pastor, I know there's so much in the life of a parish, and this is such a long and complicated process. And as Father Phil said, discerning your why and knowing your reason for doing something is so important. So I was wondering if you could speak to what does a successful discernment process look like in a congregation, and what are some pitfalls that can be avoided, and just anything from a pastor's heart you might want to share about that process.
Sure. I'm laughing, first of all, because for all of us who went to seminary, you did not learn how to do development in seminary. I am 100% sure that you didn't. And yet God calls us to be able to walk into these spaces. I'm sure, like my brother there, we've all learned far more about building maintenance and upkeep and development than we ever thought we wanted to. But when the congregation decides or starts to have the inkling that we need to do something, God is leading us to do something, I think being really grounded in your faith and grounded in the sense of calling, grounded in the sense of who you are and what God is calling you to do. I'm looking at Park Presidio folks over there, Park Presidio United Methodist Church, and I used to be their district superintendent, and that I don't know that there was a formal discernment process as much as there was a vision and faithful people who said, we believe God wants to do something more with us. And I think you can have long, protracted discernment processes But until you get to the point where you say, I believe that God wants to do something with us, then you really can't go forward. And that's where we get stuck in the analysis of paralysis. For many of our churches, we do discernment processes that have no end.
Amen.
Many of them are in a binder on a shelf somewhere that you've discerned and done nothing about. But I think the most effective discernment processes are ones that are rooted in faith and a sense of calling and bright eyes, like excitement, like there's people who see and want to carry this vision. And the really fundamental piece that I've seen is partnership from organizations like DCG. We cannot do it by ourselves. Most churches do not have the internal expertise, and if you do, it's just here and there. It's good to have outside people who are experts in this field come in at the beginning and have these conversations with you about your faith, about highest and best use for the property, and can see and ask questions from an educated perspective and from an outsider perspective. And I think once you have the help, we need help, and in churches a lot of times we don't ask for help. We think we can do it all by ourselves. And that would be the number one thing that I would say. Ask for help early and often. Before you start getting down the road, ask for help. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to switch the question order a little bit and ask Shannon, actually. So can you talk about the ways that the relationship between St. Mark's Square and Martin Luther Towers, what is that relationship like with the congregation? And also, to your point about asking for help with experts, I know that there's been a long process of what I would call professionalizing the management. And so I just wondered if you could speak to that and offer as a really practical example, one way of going about seeking advice and putting in structures that allow that professional advice, capabilities, resources to put into practice an affordable housing development. So
Great, yeah. I think definitely starts with asking professionals for help, as we've said. So I think, so I'll give just a brief overview of how our structure works here on the square. So we have St. Mark's Lutheran Church, which owns the building that we're in today. The church is above us, and that is its own entity. Then we have St. Mark's Square, which is a separate nonprofit corporation that owns the rest of the parcels on this square. And so they're two separate entities. St. Mark's Square is its own 501c3, its own budget, its own tax filings, everything. But we have some things set in place in our legal structure that work together to make sure that the church is still the guiding force behind St. Mark's Square, the nonprofit. So we have a couple legal things in place, and then we have a couple just in practice things that we do beyond the legal structure. So legally, as I mentioned, the mission of the nonprofit in the very beginning of our Articles of Incorporation say that St. Mark's Square is a mission of St. Mark's Lutheran Church. And there are things in the nonprofit code in California that's pretty important, what you put in your mission statement of your Articles of Incorporation. You can't deviate from that without filing with the state. And so that's set in legally in our documentation. The other thing we have, the governing structure, and this of course would vary, this is just our example. The governing structure of the corporation is actually made up of the Church Council of St. Mark's, and in the ELCA Lutheran Church, the Church Council is the governing body of the church. So there's the Church Council, and then there's a Board of Trustees of St. Mark's Square. I'm on that board. And those two entities together make up the voting membership of the corporation. So any major decisions, certainly anything that would involve the sale of the land, for example, changing the bylaws, electing new members to the board, all of those things have to be made by the joint council and board together. A couple other checks we have in place. The members of the Board of Trustees have to be members of St. Mark's Lutheran Church. They have to be members in good standing of the congregation. We're actually exploring the possibility of maybe having just a few at-large members where it would be people with outside expertise. I'm sure many of you in your faith communities, it's the problem of any nonprofit or faith community where you have the same people doing multiple jobs. So we don't want to overstretch our volunteers too much, and so maybe bringing a bit of outside expertise in. But also, it's structured so the church council always has more members than the Martin Luther Tower board. So if for some reason there was some ideological difference, the church council would have more votes than the board in terms of, actually if it came down to it and we were really in a disagreement, the church council would have kind of power, majority votes. So that's how our structure is set up legally, and it's worked for us. It was set up that way in the 60s, but we recently, within the past 5 years, did a really comprehensive assessment of our governance. We hired a consultant who works with congregations and church councils to make sure that our governance structure still worked for us. It would work for the scale that we're anticipating or that we're hoping for with our developments. We had attorneys on both sides, and it felt a little bit like, oh, really? We need to have 2 different lawyers talking? It just felt like we don't need to bring lawyers into this, but we really did. We needed attorneys from both sides to look at the church bylaws, the board bylaws, and make sure everything was structured so that it would work to serve our purposes and also for the church to maintain the guiding principles. So we did that. We have professional staff, we have an executive director, we have professional accountants doing our books, because when you get to a certain level, you need to be audited. We're not quite at that level yet, but we actually go through an audit process every year just to make sure. The money flows get very complicated between the who owns the auditorium, who's renting out this space for this event, and that was all, it had worked over the years. It was literally called handshake agreements. They were written down, but they really needed to be tightened up. We had a professional look, make sure that all the money flows were clean. So we took a look at the bylaws and made sure they were still relevant. We actually added the word vulnerable because we had elderly people as one of our target populations, but we added the word vulnerable to kind of expand our scope so that we can really understand and be more flexible with what the city needs, where the funding opportunities may be, so that we're serving, our bylaws allow us to serve the population that still feels close to the church's heart, but the bylaw wording is a little bit expanded. So long process. Definitely this would all be after you've done the discernment that the others have talked about. So you have the discernment, then you need to set the professional and legal structure in place so that you can really do the work you want to do, but you've got a sound legal grounding and the right sort of control or guidance that you're looking for. So that's a nutshell. We could talk about how the money flows for 3 hours, but we're not going to do that. But I can talk more after. There's also other members of our board here if you have specific questions about our structure.
May, could I just hop in real
Absolutely.
quick?
Yeah.
I'm jealous of that structure. For a variety of reasons, when we entered into this, we decided to have All Souls just lease the land to the developer. In our case, it was Satellite Affordable Housing Associates, or SAHA. Our brothers across town, St. Paul AME, they've decided to do just that and form a separate 501c3, St. Paul's Housing, that enters into the relationship. I feel like we missed an opportunity there. It's in a way, it's easier and cleaner not to develop a 501c3 and just lease to the partner. However, you lose some of the potential to shape what happens next and next and next. And by that I mean like 20 years, 40 years, 60 years, 80 years down the road.
Right.
And so it takes more work, as you say, and it involves more money and more time and more expertise. But if you can form that second 501c3, then you can be a partner at the table in a way that if you're leasing the land, you just aren't.
Please.
I just want to jump in. Yeah, that structure is beautiful. And I just want to say, if you do something with that structure, please be sure to consult with St. Mark's, because how they did it, having their church members being the guiding force, is very, very, very important. And that can shift and change over the years. And I'm not going to go into that, but that piece right there is super important. Do not let that nonprofit corporation get away from the guidance of the church.
Yeah, there have been definitely some high-profile cases even in the neighborhood where the board and the church have found themselves at odds, and the board has done something contrary to the church's wishes. So we even looked in our recent process of should we make St. Mark's Square a subsidiary organization of the church, and that was something that the attorneys looked at. We ultimately decided not to. We did want St. Mark's Square, the nonprofit, to have certain autonomy that it needed. But we kept enough mechanisms in place, as I mentioned, to make the churches still our guiding force.
Great. Well, I want to ask a question to Christina about the Episcopal Impact Fund, kind of to switch gears a little bit, but as a faith-based philanthropic organization, how do you think about how to prioritize the projects or congregations that receive support from you, and what can congregations do to prepare themselves to have conversations with you, to work with you, and perhaps to work with other, grant-making or supportive nonprofits like you?
Oh, such a big question.
Yeah,
Okay.
we're here for the big questions.
It was a lot.
Yeah.
I would say for our, so as I mentioned before, we have various pillars to our work. For our grant-making processes, we have open grant-making cycles, which means that we encourage organizations, nonprofit organizations that are addressing, preventing, resolving homelessness and housing insecurity to apply for what is an open cycle. It will open in March of this year. It's a very transparent process. The board of directors is deeply, deeply involved. We have 2 members, current and past program committee chairs in this room who go through a discernment process and in order to allocate grant funding. We also have a separate round of funding, which is specifically for congregations within the Episcopal Diocese of California for funding their safety net programs. Again, this notion of church and street interaction, if there's food banks or warming shelters or anything that really addresses the urgent need of vulnerable neighbors within the church's neighborhood, we will provide funding for that because many of the churches cannot otherwise operate these programs without this funding. So we're happy to do that. Truthfully, we don't say no to the congregations, so so all of them are funded that apply. So that is not a discernment process. We just say yes. Because the programs are important, so we fund them. Regarding the faith-based affordable housing work, so currently this is new work within the Diocese of California. So this, my predecessor in this role, I've been in this seat almost 2 years. My predecessor was working in this space for a couple years before me, but that's it. It's new to the diocese outside of really the work of All Souls. To use kind of a global lens of the diocese. And so we are really working on resource building internally, right? Not all, we spoke to, seminaries are not teaching this work. And so, so many of the churches that come to us with an interest in building or just looking at their land, or they say like, hey, we have this little bit of garden, can we do something with it, right? Like we have to have a lot of conversations with churches and with leadership to, we walk this discernment pathway with them because many of the leaders of churches are, this is just not within their skill set. Their skill set is a very different skill set than mine. And so we really intentionally sit at the table with churches. We really partner with partner with the churches that we work at. We work as kind of an extension of the team, particularly because within the structure of the Episcopal Church, there is a vestry, and vestries rotate. So the members of vestries rotate. So if we look at kind of the grand arc of real estate development, it takes a very long time, which means the folks sitting in the vestry seats are going to change over time. And so you really need, when you endeavor to build affordable housing on your properties, you need a team that will be that will be with you for the long haul. And so Episcopal Impact Fund really is committed to sitting at the table with churches and listening and really representing and being part of the church's team as they work towards building housing. So that is of the utmost importance to us, is to provide this level of like continuity. And frankly, like what we offer churches is sometimes compatible with skills that they're looking for to make this a reality, right? We are good with budgets, right? Like we can project manage. We can start driving this process forward in a way that without doing so, there are endless hiccups, endless problems, endless times where we go, what do I do with that, right? Like, and so we have the knowledge of the team to see if there's skills that we don't have, we know who to call, right? Exactly as Phil was saying, that we have a team of attorneys and developers and engineers, et cetera, who we call for all of these questions that inevitably come up as part of this process. We are currently working with, so the pipeline that we're working with right now amongst churches that we're actively engaged in this kind of discernment and development process within the diocese, and a large plot of land owned by the diocese, the capacity is around, if we, there's endless hiccups along the way, as we just said, but it's a pipeline of like 500-ish units. So it's a lot of housing that is potential on just one small diocese's land, right? And just the folks who have raised their hands and said, I'm interested in those. Unfortunately, I know this is sponsored by the San Francisco Interfaith Council, and this is a lot of, many of you are from SF. All of these properties that we're working on are in the East Bay, because we, as the Impact Fund, we support multiple counties, 5 counties. And so the churches who have just reached out to us have been East Bay congregations. So it's a lot of Contra Costa properties who have very large parking lots and adjacent lands, right? As Stacey spoke to earlier, a lot of these places that were built in a different time. And so, they are, as an example, like a church on a hill, right? Which is beautiful from the church, but there's like a lot of downslope, which is very difficult to develop, right? And so we do a lot of sitting at the table with the church to say, okay, so like, can we, like, here's the grand parcel, how do we think through the life of the church, this living congregation of people, and in the idea of a capitalized ground lease, a 75-year plus relationship will be developed with the houser, right? So how do we think through how the church can function on this property perhaps differently, right? How do we not accept like this is the exact parcel? How do we look at driveways? How do we look at parking? How do we look at very practical things in the life of the church that will define, in many ways, the relationship, the geographic and structural relationship with future residents who will live here, right? So we engage in a lot of conversations with like that as well. I will say that although we are chartered by the diocese, the Episcopal Diocese, there's nothing, we are happy to work with anyone who is thinking through this process. There is nothing about us that, we welcome conversations and working alongside any faith tradition at all. Our interest is really in terms of units of housing. We strongly believe that this public health crisis of homelessness that we see in our neighborhoods, as we spoke to before, right, folks who are housed but experiencing very high rent burdens that are causing, we just saw in the Chronicle last week, right, significantly longer lines at food banks, right, as there's heightened food insecurity in our neighborhoods right now. This ties hands, right? This is exactly in line with the lack of affordable housing. If folks are spending more money on housing and utilities, they're spending less money on food. We are happy to walk alongside any organizations who are doing this work, because we really, really see multiple models of affordable housing in every neighborhood in our region is needed in order to resolve this crisis.
Right. Well, I would open it up for any final remarks you'd like to share. Otherwise, thank you so much to each of you for being here. It's been wonderful to hear from you, so thank you. Yeah, we can give a round of applause.
We're excited about this first, what we're calling a master class. Part 1, we'll have part 2 right after lunch. But the master class is really is geared toward getting into the practical process of developing on church-owned property. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to serve, if you will, as the voice of the church. Now, let me just set the stage real quickly. I'm a pastor in Oakland, California. I have a church in Oakland, and I have 40 years of real estate experience in the lending arena, in the transaction arena, and in the development arena. So I understand now a lot more than I understood then when we were doing it. And so I want to take us through and be your voice, if you will, for some of the questions that I learned later on that I didn't know what to ask early on. And so we'll go through that process, and then we'll open it up for your questions directly. Is that okay? All right. Well, we have a panel of some experts here, and I'm pleased to recognize them. We have the two individuals that we have on our panel is Caroline McCormick. We're going to allow them to introduce themselves, and then we have the next panelist on our panel this morning is LJ Jennings. You might recognize the similarity of the names. But there is a relationship there. She is now carrying my first grandson.
He's so excited.
So you have to make sure she's well taken care of. With that, we're going to go ahead and pass it to Caroline. Caroline, go ahead and share with us who you are and what you do.
Wow, it's a family affair, right? Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I'm Caroline McCormack, and I'm Vice President of Lending and Policy at the Housing Accelerator Fund. And the Housing Accelerator Fund is a community development financial institution, so a lender that funds affordable housing projects in San Francisco. And we were created in 2017 to really, with the investment from the City of San Francisco to help expedite and accelerate the production and preservation of affordable housing in the city, in acknowledgement that the city had really ambitious goals, but public funding sources sometimes move really slowly, as many of you may know, and so our role is to really help the city out in meeting those ambitious goals, and with a particular focus on reducing the cost and time for the delivery of affordable housing in San Francisco. So I'm looking forward to talking more about that.
And do you provide funding from pre-development through construction, or just on the construction side of it?
We do. Increasingly, we do. I think historically we've done bridge lending for a particular program for the City of San Francisco called the Small Sites and Large Sites program. So that's an acquisition rehabilitation program. And I think relevant to this group, pre-development financing is also a product that we offer.
Excellent, excellent. And we'll talk more about pre-development and how important that is to the overall development process. If you're thinking about developing on your land, you really need to have pre-development dollars. It's the most riskiest dollars, it's the most difficult dollars, but it's the most necessary dollars. It's wonderful to have land, but if you can never bring it to market without the pre-development dollars, it makes really no sense. So, Lauren.
All right, good morning, everyone. I feel like I've already introduced myself, but again, I'm with DCG Strategies, and as you just learned, I am a PK, so my father is a pastor, and it's interesting because, so I am obviously with DCG, I'm in real estate, my father is in real estate, and my father is also in ministry, and life will take you down a journey that you never thought you'd go down. I always used to say, going to my father's office in real estate, I never want to be in real estate, because I hated going to the office every day after school. And here I am. I've been doing real estate now for 10 years, and I'm doing it with ministry. So I'm working in the ministry and helping to support ministry. So honored to be here, and thank you so much for joining us.
Share with the group real quickly, Lauren, DCG's role as a owner's rep.
Yeah, so our role is we serve as what's called an owner representative. And this is a role that if you are considering development or really truly anything with your real estate, I encourage you, highly, 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 highly encourage you to seek out and to find an owner representative. And as the owner representative, we serve as as really your fiduciary. We help protect you as a house of worship, and we help to protect your best interest. And so a lot of times as houses of worship are seeking to, in this case, develop land, you would likely go and partner with a developer. And so our role would be to bring the real estate and the development expertise. We would serve as an extension of your ministry team and your leadership team, and we would help you uncover a lot of the questions that you just don't know to ask. So I think, in our first session, Father Brochard, I believe is his last name, was saying, hey, there's a lot of things that I wish I would have known. I wish I would have knew that I could ask for a developer fee. I wish I would have known, to structure my deal or structure the transaction this way. And so we bring that expertise and we help you as a congregation know everything the developer knows. We also help if you're working numbers, which a lot of it is like, how do the numbers work? What do we get in exchange for it, right? We can work all the numbers that any of your partners can, and we can help to, keep them accountable and make sure that you truly are protected throughout the process and that you can, stay around to be able to continue to serve your ministry for years to come.
And then just to add real quickly, they can also help with the visioning.
Right.
The visioning component of, we have land, what do we really do? What works? What makes sense for not just the congregation, not just for the land, not just for the neighborhood and the community, but really how do we really put this all together? And so everything from beginning to end is really, and I just want to re-echo that what she said is how critical it is for churches that you get someone that really represents you, works with you, that you have a relationship with, you built a relationship with, that's working on your behalf. It's not to say that your nonprofit housing developers are not trusted partners.
Right.
I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm suggesting trust but verify. All right, we're gonna hear from Caroline. She has a presentation for us.
Great. So I was tasked with talking about some basics of affordable housing finance in San Francisco. We're going to keep it really surface level, but then I'll point you to some resources if you want to kind of go further. And of course, your development partners are going to be helpful in navigating the finance process as well. Since our founding in 2017, we've closed on 47 projects in the city and helped develop over 2,000 affordable homes. So, and that includes both ground floor commercial spaces as well. So going to the next slide, I also think it's important to ground us in the context of where we are right now and the history of inequity and racism that has always been woven into the way we think about housing and shelter and land. And so I think as a reminder, we're talking about right now sitting on unceded Ohlone Ramatash land, and that is a history we need to acknowledge as we are developers, as we're lenders, that being a crucial part of our history. And then I think to a similar point on the right, you see a redlining map that shows how the federal government and lenders really deprioritized and discriminated against communities in our city in the making of home loans and improvement loans. And so I think at the half we see our role, and maybe you share some of these values in acknowledging that history and not forgetting it, and then using our capital and our power to begin to chip away at some of these inequities. So really, I think, important to start from that place. Going to the next slide. So going into some sort of affordable housing basics, when we're talking about permanent affordable housing, we're really talking about a recorded long-term deed restriction on a property that keeps it affordable for perpetuity. In particular, in San Francisco, if you're using San Francisco local sources as well as state sources, that restriction is going to look somewhere in the time frame of 55 years. So that money usually comes with in exchange for a long-term restriction that sort of dictates affordability levels for your property. And affordability and income restrictions, we often think of those in kind of three main categories, although there's a spectrum there. 120, just for reference, 120% AMI in San Francisco is $186,000 for a family of 4. And then going down to, sorry, I should have worn my glasses, 80% AMI, that's $115,000. And then 30% AMI is $43,000. So just so you have that context, and when we're thinking about someone's ability to pay, we're thinking about 30% of their income going towards their rent. So that's kind of the general metrics that we're working with. I won't talk too much about rent control just to save time, but that's a different slice of the pie that we're not talking about today. So affordable housing programs in San Francisco kind of fall into 3 main buckets. The first one is the inclusionary housing program, and that is where a market rate developer is setting aside units by city ordinance and requirement for low-income households within their building, or paying a fee that then goes into a fund that gets used to develop affordable housing off-site. So that's one bucket of programs. The second bucket of programs, which Kira talked a bit about, is the 100% affordable housing portfolio, and that's the one that the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development really manages and works with development partners to deploy those funds. And then we have Section 8 vouchers that is run through the San Francisco Public Housing Authority. You can use those on sort of in pairing with MOCD programs, but that is another just entity that comes into play when you're thinking about layering the different sources. And then just to put a fine point on it, income is the main sort of qualifying threshold for housing. And so, if you're looking at, and that can look different in a different building, in each building, and sort of based on the type of financing structure that you've got in place. Typically MOCD financing is going up to 120% AMI, which we think of as like middle income housing. And I talk a little bit about if you're using city funding, you are also subject to the city's requirements around marketing and lease up. There's a lottery and there's preferences that I've listed there. So that's something to really think about if you're going to be using city funding. It's going to come with requirements around how the marketing and lease up process works. And so going in with open eyes about sort of your ability to kind of choose who's living in your buildings is limited by the types of funding sources that you have. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, this is just a cool graphic to show that a lot of different folks live in affordable housing, from making 10% AMI all the way up to 140% AMI. It's really can be for all different members of our community. And yeah, it covers a different range of households and community members. You can go to the next slide.
Excuse me, on that, what was EMT roommate?
EMT. What's that? Emergency medical tech.
Oh.
Yes. Yeah. Wasn't expecting to answer a question about that one, but cool. All right, so on sort of basic, when folks say capital stack, what do they mean? And I'll just, again, keep it really high level. This can get as specific and in the weeds as we want, but showing a new construction capital stack. On the left, this is a typical market rate capital stack. So you have a loan, which is like a mortgage you pay on your house, and then equity, which is like the down payment you're putting on the cash into the project. And on a market rate deal, the rents, because they're market rate, can cover that loan, that mortgage, as well as a return on investment for that equity. But in affordable housing, because by design rent is restricted to be affordable to low-income households, it gets more complicated. So you see here that in an affordable housing development, the loan, so that mortgage is actually, ends up being really small. So the rents, because they're restricted, cannot support a large mortgage. And the equity in this scenario is tax credit equity, so the low-income housing tax credit. So institutional investors get a tax break for investing in affordable housing projects. So that's gonna show up on a project and often be an essential piece of your capital stack. And then in addition to that, most projects will also need subsidy. So that's the city public funding source in a lot of cases, but it could also be philanthropic funds, it could be grant funding, and other forms of what we call gap financing. So that's really covering the gap between the equity and what the project can support in terms of permanent mortgage to really, close the gap to make these projects happen. And of course, that subsidy layer has a ton of different sources. Could be local sources, there could be, state funding sources, and it's really complicated in California, and that's where you really want to have a good both development consultant, but also financial consultant who can help you layer these various funding sources together to make a project work. Yeah.
Speaking of layering, I might insert one thing. I was a lender for many years. I actually think you have the order backwards. The loan should be above the subsidy. In the stack, the subsidy should be below the loan, because one thing lenders always require is that the regulations be subordinated to their lien on the property. And so in the stack, the loan's actually number one.
That's a good point. I will say the deed restriction is going to be kind of the first thing on title as the first.
And then you spend time arguing about that deed restriction.
Yeah. But that's a good nuance to point out too, and like that hard paying debt, we call that sort of mortgage, is going to be the first money out to pay your perm debt lenders. So you can go to the next slide. This is a very basic example of showing sort of rent in a project and the income that generates and what that goes to pay. And I heard someone earlier talk about churches really knowing about operating expenses and managing those budgets. There's similar concepts here where in this particular example, you've got a 4-unit household or 4-unit building. You see the annual incomes of the households and the rents that they're paying. So that's coming to, in this very basic example, a building income of $4,500. But then you have operating expenses, paying for utilities, paying for maintenance, for operating the building that have to come out of that. And that leaves you with what we call a net operating income. So that's the $3,000 that can then go to service your debt. And again, because rent levels are by design lower, covering that debt service is not possible sometimes. And so you have to backfill, depending on where the AMI levels are, with subsidy to make up that gap. And the lower the incomes are, the more of that subsidy you're going to need, in a very sort of basic example. So that was a lot, and there's a lot of nuance there. And there's actually a really great resource that I wanted to point you all to. This is the Turner Center at Berkeley. They just came out with a really cool interactive tool called Demystifying Development Math. Again, you're gonna have a team that can help you navigate these many complex programs. But I think having empowering yourself with the basic knowledge so that you know what your financial consultant, the confines of what your financial consultant is talking about, and really kind of have the basics down is going to make your job easier and empower you in the process as the church, I would say. So yeah, feel free to check that out. And then you can go to the next one. Kira kind of talked about this a little bit, but I think key to those graphs that I showed is the role of public subsidy, particularly in San Francisco, a high-cost market, in making these deals pencil. And so this shows both past and projected public subsidy dollars in the city of San Francisco. It costs upwards of $1 million per unit to build housing in the city, new construction. And so again, just re-emphasizing that public subsidy is going to be kind of a crucial gap closer on these deals. We've looked at some middle income examples where maybe the AMI levels are, area median income levels are like 120% to 140%, maybe not needing public subsidy in those types of scenarios, but in today's interest rate environment, even at sort of the middle income levels, some shallow subsidy or form of public subsidy is really needed to make these deals pencil, which is at least what we're seeing right now in the current interest rate environment. And so typically per unit, we're looking at $250,000 to $500,000 in local subsidy sources. You can go to the next slide. So as Kira alluded to, the funding environment for public subsidy sources is very constrained right now, but luckily there's some really important bond measures on the ballot to help unlock these subsidy dollars that are so crucial to making these deals work. In March, on the San Francisco bond, there will be Prop A, which will be $300 million for the production and preservation of affordable housing, so unlocking those subsidy dollars at the local level. In November, there'll be a regional bond, so the 9-county Bay Area region, of $10 to $20 billion to help unlock subsidy dollars to really catalyze preservation and production in our region. And then there's also a state bond measure, Prop 1, the State Behavioral Health Infrastructure Bond, which is a general obligation bond to really unlock mental health treatment beds and also supportive housing dollars, so capital dollars to provide supportive housing. So just to point out that there's a lot of resources that might be in our future to help unlock more resources to make your deals pencil. But we got to vote and support these efforts at both the local and regional and state level. So you can go to the next slide. A little bit about HAF's programs and lending products, so kind of bucketed into the types of lending products we've historically provided. I talked a bit about the AC rehab bridge lending that we do, not as relevant to this group, but the land acquisition and pre-development loans are another loan product that we offer. So, getting your architectural services done and any of sort of the pre-entitlement work that needs to be done to get your buildings built, we do provide those types of loans. And we also increasingly are providing perm loans. We're just working on getting the longer term capital sources to be able to provide more of that because we've heard that that's a need in the market. And then also providing construction loans as well, which we've done some of as well. So that's I guess the sort of big takeaways from HAF and where we stand is like we're really dedicated to making projects work and thinking creatively and out of the box about your projects. So I would say like early engagement with us about the needs and where we can sort of fill the gaps is, we don't think like, oh, we only do this type of lending. We tend to take a more flexible mindset based on what the project needs. So, and I think I'm gonna stop there, my speed round, but yeah.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah. Felt like I was back in school. I remember in high school when I used to have math class just before lunch, and the numbers were just all over my head, and I just couldn't wait to get to lunch. But we're going to get down to, and I don't expect all of you to understand all of that because that's not your expertise. That's not your expertise. All of the layers of financing and all of the sources of money and all of the performas and all of those numbers that just made you dizzy, and you're probably sitting there, well, what does this have to do with me? Just give me the money. We're going to get to that because I think it's important that you understand some of this, because as you're in conversations with developers, as you're in conversations with your team, if you will, at least you're not coming into it blind and you're not coming into it with at least no understanding about what it is. So we're going to get into some of this, and then we're going to get into the practical, how do we get the money? Because I know that is most important. I know that's what I wanted when I started development. How do I get the money? And so we'll talk about that. Lauren, if you will share with us, I'm a church. Mm-hmm. I have some land. You sent me an email. I got your email. And on your website, you said, click here if you want to learn more about developing, fill out this application, fill out this information. Take me through what you and DCG does for a brand new church that just is inquiring off of your website.
Yeah, so a part of what we do, and everything that I'm saying that I'll share are things that you can do also on your own if you have the expertise. But really, we help answer the question. We always say, is there a there, right? I know I have this piece of land. I know that it's underutilized and or vacant, but I don't know, is it feasible for development? And if so, what can I do with it? So we help you uncover, is there a there, which in the development world is helping to determine, it's called helping to determine preliminary development feasibility. And so we help to answer 3 questions, and these are really 3 questions that I would urge you if you're in the beginning stages of, determining whether you want to go down this road. These are 3 questions that you really need to answer. The first is, what is physically possible on my land? And so I'll go into what that means and how we help to uncover that. The second question is, what is legally permissible on my land? I'll explain further what that means. And then the third and final question is really what Caroline talked about, is what is financially feasible, right? So if I've determined I can do development is physically possible, development is legally permissible, is it financially feasible? And those are really the first 3 questions that you should endeavor to answer as you're exploring the option of development. And so the first one is, what's physically possible? It's quite literally, what can I physically do on my site? And there's a few things that I would say you need to look at, or that we look at. The first has to just do with general topography. Do I have a flat piece of land, or is there slope or grading that's required on my land? If you do not have a flat piece of land, that does not mean that development is 100% infeasible. However, there are certain costs associated with having to make your land flat, with having to get a civil engineer to install a retaining wall, things of that nature. And so those are things that you just need to be aware of. You could have, which we've worked with plenty of congregations where, if they have, say, a 4-acre piece of land, if there's slope or grading, maybe only 2 of those acres are actually physically possible to be developed on. And so that's a big difference when you're talking about 2 acres versus 4 acres. So you really want to understand, what your topography is. Another item that's important to understand is access issues. Do I have access to the land? A lot of times, when especially dealing with houses of worship, if you have vacant or underutilized land, your parcel might be a square or a rectangle, and your buildings are at the front, and then you have neighbors on each side, and you have a neighbor behind you. And so we've worked with a lot of churches and houses of worship where they have maybe 1 acre and 1.5 acres of vacant land, but the land is landlocked, meaning that there's no way for the vacant land to be accessed aside from quite literally driving over or through someone else's land. And so access is extremely important when you're considering development. And typically, depending on the type of development, you really want at least 2 access points, or 2 access points are required in most cases. And so that's just something to consider. So for example, we worked with the church in the East Bay where they had just over 1 acre of land, and there was 2 access points that the church had, but that was quite literally their church driveway. And one of the deal breakers for the congregation, the church, was that we want a separate access point for this potential new development. And unfortunately, it just wasn't possible because our land was landlocked. And so therefore, it was determined that even though I have this land, it's not feasible for development, either because the access points aren't wide enough. You need a wide enough, it's all determined by your local jurisdiction, what the turnaround needs to be for a fire truck. And so those are things that you need to look at. The next part is, I would really encourage you, if you haven't already, to pull what's called a preliminary title report on your property. You can order that through your real estate broker, you can hire a title company to order what's called a preliminary title report. And in that title report, it will have a variety of information that pertains to your actual piece of land. And what we look for when we're pulling and ordering and reviewing title reports we want to know, are there any easements on your property? And an easement is essentially an agreement that the property owner, it could either have been you, a recent easement, or maybe it was an easement from your prior owner 50, 60, 70 years ago, because typically easements run with the property, not just with the property owner. So if the property changes hands, the easement likely still exists. And so that easement is an agreement which more than likely says that, I am agreeing to allow you to access my property. That access could be for maybe underground piping, underground pipelines. That access could be, where I need to drive through a portion of your lot in order to access my lot. And so the reason why that's important is because most of the time, easements are, well, depending on the type of easements, most easements do not allow you to develop over them. There's restrictions associated with it, right? So I'll give you another example. We worked with a congregation, and we uncovered an easement. Well, they already knew about this easement, but we were able to help them understand the easement where Hetch Hetchy actually ran through their property. And if you know anything about that, you cannot develop over anything that has Hetch Hetchy pipes underneath it. And so they had a pretty large parcel, and the unfortunate part was that the easement was literally cut their property in half. And so they had their buildings on one half and the other half was parking. And so if you look to the naked eye, it's like, whoa, we have all this vacant parking that we can develop. It was not possible because the preliminary title report determined, it said that you cannot, for whatever reason, develop over this piping, because if we need to access it, we need to access it. Other things that you want to look for on a preliminary title report are covenants and restrictions. A lot of times they're referred to CC&Rs. And very similar to an easement, but they're basically essentially restrictions that are placed on your property that could either limit development, prohibit a certain type of development, or just overall give guidance on what you can and cannot do. Another example, this was another congregation. They had 10 acres of vacant land, and they came to us and said, we want to either develop this and or sell it. We want to figure out what our options are. We pulled a preliminary title report. Shockingly, they had CC&Rs on their property that limited any development to agricultural use. These were old, they were clearly very old CC&Rs, but once again, they run with the property. And so it didn't mean that development was infeasible. It just meant that the congregation had to do a little extra work in order to allow development. And so with them, they luckily, amazingly, were able to get those CC&Rs removed. It took almost 3 years, 2.5 to 3 years, and it was a legal process. They had to hire legal attorneys, and essentially they had to go back in time, and it was a long process where basically the CC&Rs say that you can remove them, but it has to be a vote by these people. All those people were long deceased, and so they had to confirm that the people were deceased. Then they had to contact their descendants. So it was a long process. And so I say all of that to say it's really important, if you have not reviewed your preliminary title report, just to review it. Now these are, like, I would like to say, outlandish cases that I gave you, where hopefully you have a clean title report. There's no issues. You don't have anything to worry about. But one of the most difficult things that you could do is to, be far down the road, spend resources, have an agreement lined up, only to have it stalled and say, oh wait, I know I made this agreement, but really we can't perform on this agreement. So those are the questions to ask when we say physically possible. I feel like that was really long. I'm going to go faster. The second question that I said is what's legally permissible. When we say that, what's legally permissible has to do with your local jurisdiction. So whether you're located in your formal city or you're on county land, either your city or your county would be what's called your governing jurisdiction. The cities and counties, development is not haphazard. It is not random. These jurisdictions plan for development 20 and 30 years in advance. And so they already have, even though your property is a church right now, if you were to ever change use, they have an idea already of what they want that to be there. And so what's really important is to check your local zoning ordinance as well as check what's called your general plan, which will dictate what your land use designation is. Whenever you want to develop on your property, your development and your product type it is required to align with your zoning ordinance and your land use designation. And so one, you want to check what your current, zoning and general plan says about your property. And even if it doesn't allow for housing, that's not to say that it can't change. You can apply to get what's called a zone change and or a general plan amendment, basically saying, I know we have this now, but we want to change it. It's a long process. It costs money to go through that process, and it's not guaranteed. However, you can, working with a real estate consultant who's experienced, they can tell you, generally speaking, we reviewed development patterns. Generally speaking, there's a likelihood to see a path forward where the city and local community would support such a change. There's a lot of legislation, obviously, that has helped to streamline the process for houses of worship. However, typically that's limited to a certain type. And then the third and final question, as I mentioned, is development financially feasible? That has a lot to do with density and product type. And so you'll hear from developers in our next masterclass, but when we say is it financially feasible, it's basically, can I get certain economies of scale? General, very, 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 very loose rule of thumb is if you're looking for affordable housing, typically affordable housing developers want to see a minimum of 50 units. There are some that could do less. There are some who would prefer more. But typically, that's where they can receive their economies of scale. If you're looking for, maybe mixed income and/or market rate housing, you have a little more flexibility. Typically, we say like 30 units is the threshold, but these are the minimums. And so, you want to be able to understand: can my property support 50 units, right? Or sometimes you can only support 15, and therefore, you're not really going to find a developer who's going to go through the hurdle to do only 15 units, because the work is the same to change your zoning, whether you're doing 5 or 1,000 units. It's the exact same process, the exact same cost in terms of the local jurisdiction. And then the last piece when we say financially feasible is if you're looking at affordable housing, is there funding sources available? Like, is it feasible to get a capital stack for this project? And a lot of times, affordable housing dollars are super competitive. And so there is quite literally a rating and ranking system that the people with the dollars will do to say, we want to rate this project versus this project. And they're going to fund the project that checks off the most boxes on their checklist. And so those are things that we help you uncover to say, is this site likely to receive funding? We're working with a congregation. We started with them in 2016. And I'm happy to say that just last year, they finally broke ground. But it took that long for them to build their capital stack. You have to go through multiple rounds of applications to get funding. A lot of times you won't receive it, so you have to reapply during the next phase. And then you have to get dollars from multiple sources. It doesn't come just from one place. So those are things to look at as you're considering, is there a there? And typically, if you have those things, then we can say, okay, yes, your property is preliminarily feasible for development, and it would be wise to now spend further resources and further dollars to continue the effort forward. That was a lot.
And that takes us into pre-development
Right.
at that point. So that's a reason
This
why.
is before pre-development.
Exactly. Yeah, that's why you want to get an owner's representative to help you navigate and go through that. And so now we've done that. We've already responded, and we're now feasible, given our scenario. And now that we're feasible, I'm going to call Caroline. And I'm going to say, Caroline, we've retained the services of DCG Strategies. We've already uncovered the feasibility. We've already been down that road. Now we are interested in going further in this project and looking at how can we build, and we need some feasibility dollars. We need some pre-development dollars. Caroline, tell us some of the challenges that churches have when they're submitting applications or wanting to get funding. Number one, what are those pitfalls that you see churches or houses of worship go through, and what recommendations do you have for them? And then talk to us about how does the church prepare to get funding?
Sure. Yeah. And I don't think we've worked with many churches, so full disclosure on that, but I can talk a little bit about new borrowers and sort of our process on our end. So I think having done that feasibility analysis is a really great piece of it, because when a new developer comes to us, we're going to want to see that you've gone through that exercise of exploring feasibility. I don't think all of the answers have to be totally ironed out, but we'd want to know that you've hired the right folks or put in the work to do that analysis. So we typically would want to see your pro forma for the proposed development, and then kind of looking at the three different axes that you described. We would start our underwriting process to do that. So the first piece is looking at the development itself and feasibility. I think particularly for the HAF, because we work so closely with local government partners, we'd want to know that this is on their radar, and that you've thought to those local funding sources as a potential takeout source or gap financer for the project. So you're engaging with your local public sector partner as well. I think the other piece that we look at in our underwriting process is the financials of the church itself. So we'd be underwriting, looking at revenue and assets and liabilities, and really trying to dig into the details of the church's financials. I mean, we are a community development financial institution, and so we try to be flexible on our lending terms, but a part of our exercise in understanding whether we can make a loan and expect to get repaid is looking at the financial position of an organization. And then I would say a third piece for sort of newer developers we're working at, we're going to really kind of look to like the team you've assembled to see if it is a team that has experience. If you don't have experience yourself, like who has experience on the team that can help fill that gap. So, particularly like if you're working in San Francisco as the architect that you're thinking of partnering with, have experience with projects in San Francisco. Do they know how to navigate the entitlement process? And then from there, I think we would dig into your proposed pre-development budget. So, we provide pre-development loans from anywhere from like $1 to $3 million. It's looking at the proposed use of those funds, and then, ultimately how our pre-development loan would get repaid. So that's the general confines. I don't know, Rebecca, would you want to add anything? That's our CEO, but yeah.
How many years of financials do you want from the house of worship or the faith-based entity, the church or nonprofit developer? I mean,
It's typically 3 years.
Okay.
So we would look at your audits for the past 3 years, income statements, balance sheet statements, your annual report, and kind of piece together the financial story between those components.
I want to make sure that you got 3 years of financials. Now, this is also important. Most churches do not have to go through audits. Most churches do not have to do audits. That is super, super important for you to understand. Because if you don't do audits, and because that, if you heard what Caroline said, one of the things she said was, we're going to ask for 3 years worth of financials and audits and all of that. Most churches don't really have to do that if you're purely a religious institution, that is, with no other income sources. So then that means it's going to be super critical then that you have your financials, your bookkeeping is really intact. And there's times where the lender will not require, because you're not required to have audits, they won't require an audit, but they're going to scrutinize your financials even that much more. So make sure that you have those financials together. Lauren, when we've gone to Caroline has given us some information on what we need to do. Talk to us about how does DCG help us to assemble a team?
Right. So the next step in terms of our owner representative services is exactly that, helping to put together a successful team. And as I'm sure we've heard, it's really important to have a team that's experienced, and a lot of times it's required to have a team that has the local experience in terms of what you're looking to build. And so a part of what we do is, what we really want you as a congregation to have a voice in is making sure that you partner with other entities that are a good culture fit for your organization. And that is something that we cannot stress enough. It has to be a good culture fit for your organization. And so part of what we do is, as was said before, is we help congregations go through a discernment process to, if you have not already done it, or if you're not clear on sort of what your values are, what your priorities are, what your sort of walk-away points are, which I know was talked about in the first session, like what are the things that we really want to hold firm to? We help walk you through that process so that you're crystal clear on what those items are. And then once you're crystal clear on what those items are, then we can help partner with, help couple you with development partners and development team members who align with those values. And so a part of that process can look a variety of different ways. Typically what we recommend is creating what's called a request for proposals. And you stating your objectives up front. This is our goal. This is what we want to do. These are our requirements. We're looking for a partner who aligns with this. And then we'll send it out to all of the local players and then have them respond and actually submit proposals for you. One thing that we always want to make sure that you do is you review all of your options. And so that you feel confident when you make a decision. You can feel confident that when we partner with such and such entity, we've talked to everyone we need to talk to, we've interviewed them. I always say we always recommend holding an interview, either on Zoom or in person. Because when we receive different proposals, it's one thing to read it, but you really want to talk to the principals and you really want to talk to whoever is going to be your key point of contact, your project manager, just to make sure, once again, it's a good culture fit. And that to us is key because this will be your partner for the long run. You will be in meetings with them, in conversations with them, email exchanges with them. And so you really want to make sure that, again, who you're partnering with, I can't stress this enough, is just a good culture fit for you. So we help walk you through that process. We help you structure the RFP. Like I said, we'll market the RFP. We'll field all questions. We'll help schedule and host the interviews, and then we'll also, if you're have a vestry or a board or whatever your decision-making entity is, we'll then help facilitate a conversation of, okay, what are the things that you heard? Did you hear this? What are the things that you didn't hear? Do we need to have follow-up questions? So again, walk you through that process so that when you make the decision, you feel completely comfortable with that decision.
Can I add on one point to that? And I think just speaking from the lender's perspective, sort of the part two of that is if it's particularly a new joint venture, we'd want to see a memorandum of understanding that lays out the roles and responsibilities, not only in the good times, but in the bad times when there's potentially conflict or difference in opinion, that is worked out and really delineated in a document. We would want to see that and vet that as part of our underwriting process.
Absolutely, definitely. Partners, let me just give you who this team, let me give you the individuals that are part of your team, ultimately, that if you're going to go down development. One of the partners is a financial partner, or that's going to do all of your financial consulting, right? And we're going to come to Caroline in that just a second. But you're going to have a financial consultant. They're going to run all your numbers, provide your performas. They're going to do all of your number crunching. And what they're also going to do, which is very important, they're going to look out in the landscape of available funding sources, right. Pots of money. What do I mean? You might be interested in building senior housing, but maybe there's not a pot of money for senior housing. But maybe the pot of money is for persons with disabilities, or maybe the pot of money is for something else. So they're going to look out over the landscape of dollars and help you identify, so that you can make sure that as you focus on your project, then you're focusing on the right community and constituency in order to get the funding that you need. So you're going to have a financial partner. You're going to have an architect. I believe Caroline mentioned something about that earlier. You're going to have an architect that's going to be experienced in your particular locale. Somebody that does the kind of building that you're interested in building. So you're going to have that architect. You're going to have and it was already said, the JV partner, or better yet, your experienced nonprofit housing developer, right? And I use that term nonprofit housing developer because much of what we're going to do as faith-based organizations is typically nonprofit housing development and typically affordable development. I'm not aware of a whole lot of faith-based organizations that are building market rate housing. So you're gonna partner with a nonprofit housing developer. That's going to be the other individual on your team, in addition to your owner's rep, in addition to your lending partner, and those things. So those are some critical entities that you're going to make sure you partner with. Now, having said that, Caroline, help to take us through what the financial partner, the financial consultant, does for the development.
Sure, yeah. So that capital stack I went through, it's way more intricate than the 3 blocks that I spelled out. So they're gonna help you assemble that capital stacks. So thinking through the different public funding sources available to the project. If you're accessing low-income housing tax credits, they're gonna give you some initial assessment of how your project would score under the current criteria for the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee, and that help you sort of figure out like how your project would slot into and score, as you mentioned, the very competitive process. They're gonna help you kind of figure out the AMI levels based on those various funding sources. They're gonna have different requirements. And then, obviously to make the project feasible as well. I think further down the line, they'll also help you assemble the sort of debt and equity pieces of the puzzle. So, as I mentioned earlier, that's going to be going out to institutional investors like Bank of America or JP Morgan Chase to shop your project around for debt and equity. So it's really all of the numbers pieces that's super complicated, helping you layer all those together. And there's a couple financial consultants, that I think we work with regularly, who we trust and who know the program. So I think, again, it's finding a financial consultant that is aware of California affordable housing finance programs and has a track record of helping clients, layer those sources.
All right, I'm going to ask Lauren one question. I'm going to give you some things that I want you to write down and consider and think about, and then we're going to open up for questions. The question that Lauren mentioned earlier, as a rule of thumb, 50 units is kind of the threshold. There's some nuances, but right around 50 people in terms of penciling, in terms of feasibility, in terms of making the numbers work, and that's pretty standard. However, I don't have a site that can build 50 units. I only have a site that can build 20. I can only have a site that build 20. But I'm in fellowship with another ministry 8 blocks away. And they have a site that they can only build 30. Is it possible for us to do something together? Lauren.
Yes. Now, that's a nuanced yes. So, yes, that is something that could be possible that you can look into. It's called scattered site development. But essentially, if there are multiple sites within a general small radius, then a developer could see those as one project. Mm-hmm. And so that is something that would be really key. Also another example would be, assemblage, right? Maybe you want to assemble parcels together to create one large development. So it's very nuanced, but potentially that could be an option and could be something for consideration. Again, it's what's called a scattered site development.
Great. All right, a couple things I just want to share really quickly, and I think it was mentioned earlier. There's a regional bond that is being floated around right now, and I think that you want to pay attention to that regional bond, housing bond. It is going to be billions of dollars, literally. So you want to be aware of the regional bond. You also want to be aware. You want to, as a faith-based organization, community-based organization, you really want to be in tune to legislative things that deal with housing. You've got to stay, if you're interested in the housing, you've got to stay up on top of all of the legislative pieces, both the city, the county, and as well as the state as it relates to all housing, so that you can be a lot more informed about that. And then there is, all of this is driven, and I think it was mentioned by someone earlier, it's all driven by what they call the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, RHNA as it's called. Regional Housing Needs Assessment. Once you know what that is, it becomes easier to get involved with that, because they, meaning the cities, have a demand, a requirement by the state in order to build so many housing units. And so once you understand that, then you can use that information to help drive your project. And then lastly, I want to just make mention that, and maybe someone will talk about this later on, as it relates to pre-development, as it relates to some of your capacity development, there are Section 4 grants. Section 4 grants. LISC, Enterprise, they can give you Section 4 dollars that helps you build your capacity in order to do housing. And at this point, I know that you're burning with some questions. Questions from the audience. We need you to speak aloud. Yes, right up here.
Please wait for the microphone.
She's bringing, okay. We're recording, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is really helpful. A bunch of us are from either San Mateo County or Marin County. So, Caroline, what's your counterpart in those counties?
Yeah, well, luckily the half recently got approval to expand to the 9-county region. So, although San Francisco is our base and will be our base, we work in the 9-county region. So you could definitely talk to us. And we also, our chief investment officer has a lot of relationships in the South Bay. So in terms of like development partners and local contacts, we also have someone on our team who has that expertise as well. So,
right up front here.
When you say 50 units, are you talking about 50 SRO size or one-bedroom studios, two bedrooms? What do we mean by a minimum of 50 units?
50 living units, whether they're SROs, one bedrooms, two bedrooms. It's kind of a rule of thumb. So, but really 50 individual units.
Right.
Right over here, please, right up front.
I have a two-part question I actually wanted to ask of the pastors who are on the previous panel, but I will ask Lauren instead because I think it's the same question. And in fact, you actually answered this a bit already, but the question was, what did you find was the first thing that you had to understand but not know as a congregation? And the assumption there is that you're going to partner. And so what is the first thing you found that you had to, that you didn't have to know, that you could depend, matter of fact, reasonably should depend on someone else to give you the answer?
Right, great question. A lot, I would say. And I say that to say, once you find your partners and experts that you trust them. They are experts for a reason. So, for example, and I think one of we discussed it on the first panel was have your sort of deal breakers and then be willing for anything and everything else to change. And that's quite true. So, an example would be, which was mentioned already, the type of housing that you're providing, right? Like, you can be open to providing some sort of affordable housing, but I would say the more flexible you are in terms of what that type is, whether it's veterans housing, whether it's senior housing, be open to that because as we said, the capital stack, there might not be funding dollars available for the type of community housing that you're looking for, but there are prime dollars available for veteran housing or whatever have you. So be open and flexible to pretty much anything and everything, as long as you first go through that just very important discernment process to make sure you're crystal clear on what your values and your priorities are for the ultimate development.
Let me add one other thing to that because I think that there's one other piece that is absolutely significant that we learn typically later on down the line, and that's the governance of the entity. Because you're going to interact with a principle of that entity, but that principle may not have the authority.
Right.
So we've got to, and sometimes we don't learn that until down the road where all of a sudden you're called to a congregation meeting and the congregation hadn't heard anything about it. So governance is the key too.
The second part of the question I think is informed by the answers you just gave. And it is, how do you advise your clients on the faith-based understanding of highest and best use?
So great question. So the term highest and best use is really an appraisal term. It essentially says if I wanted to maximize my yield in an effort to maximize my revenue from the property, what would that use be? And so sometimes that use aligns with the missional priorities of the organization. Sometimes it doesn't. And so what we typically help walk congregations through is first we'll just do a general from a real estate perspective, taking out the mission for the first part. What does the real estate say is the highest and best use? Then we'll also simultaneously but separately have conversations in terms of what are your missional priorities and your missional objectives. And really the goal is to blend the two to where you are maximizing the value of your real estate, but it's in alignment and in support of your mission. And so when we typically go through the process, we typically will rate and rank sort of, okay, this is your maximum revenue, this gives you medium revenue, this gives you lowest revenue. This is your highest missional priority, medium, low. And the goal is, your gold star is to have high missional priority, high revenue. A lot of times that does not happen. So one example is, this wasn't for development, but this was for sale of a property. We worked with a congregation. They had a large piece of land, and we received multiple offers to sell the property for development. And that was not in alignment with their missional objectives. And so I believe the highest offer we received was close to $15 million. They ended up selling the property for almost half, for $8 million, to an organization that aligned with their missional objective. That's a big gap, 15 and 8 million. However, their missional objective was, first and foremost, was key to them. And so a part of what we help do is, again, making sure we understand from a real estate perspective, that's your baseline. And then how much are you willing to part or separate from that, I guess, to make sure your mission is first and foremost.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our panel.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
I just wanted to take this opportunity again to say how honored and happy we are to have all of you here. And also to remind you, and there are details about this on the back of the booklet that you picked up when you walked in, the complement to this series of conferences that is generously supported by the San Francisco Foundation is what we're calling a pre-development feasibility program. And this is provided by DCG Strategies, and there's an application on our website. So we have funding to provide pre-development feasibility analyses, all of those things that Lauren talked about in the panel, to help you understand whether there's a there, as we say, and do those initial studies to get you ready to talk to a developer and take that next step. So just a quick reminder to please go to our website and apply. I also have business cards there if you want to email me directly. I'm happy to connect you with that resource. So we do hope you apply. That's a really critical part of the process, and there are funds available to support you. So thank you.
All right, welcome back from lunch. Hopefully you got filled up, and let's thank DCG and San Francisco Foundation for lunch. All right, we're going to go further in this conversation that we've been having relative to developing on faith-based owned properties. We have a dynamic panel before you for this afternoon to take us further in those conversations and some of the things that we as nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations, want to think about. How do we repurpose our land into housing? And this next panel are going to be instrumental and important in that process. And so we have with us, and I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. We have the Director of Real Estate Development from Mercy Housing. We have this Senior Planner from the San Francisco Planning Department. And then we have an attorney with Gofarb and Lippman. And so we're going to start right on the end and allow Rami to introduce herself. Tell us about yourself and your organization and what you do in terms of this whole notion of working with faith-based organizations to repurpose their land.
Hello, everyone. How are you? Can you hear me okay? Yeah. All right. You'll raise your hand if you cannot, because I'm a little soft-spoken. So my name is Rami. It's like Do-Re-Mi. And I'm the Director of Real Estate for the Bay Area for Mercy Housing California. Mercy Housing is a not-for-profit organization, and we were founded over 40 years ago by the Sisters of Mercy, led a group of different Catholic women religious to establish the organization when they noticed that there was an affordable housing crisis in the country and that new housing needed to be produced for the economically poor. So that organization has evolved from nuns working together to establish the organization and figuring things out to the organization that we are today. We're actually one of the largest national not-for-profit affordable housing developers, and then I work in the California group and specifically here in the Bay Area. And there are some slides, I don't know if we'll put them up, but just to let you know kind of our scope. So we have offices in Sacramento, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, but we'll work anywhere where there's opportunity like land and funding, and as we all know, the need is everywhere. And we've been able to produce, I have to look this up because it changes. We've been able to produce 11,000 affordable homes in California, in the about almost 1,600 different developments or communities. And we have about over 3,000 affordable units, you can hear the word units a lot, in our pipeline. So that's what we have that's currently in planning, pre-development. You're going to learn the word pre-development or construction. And we're hoping to be able to expand that even more through the work that we would do with you, for example. We do have a lot of work with faith-based groups over our 40-year history, and I have a flyer that I left somewhere. Hopefully you all saw it, and there's some examples that we can talk about, but just to give you a little bit of some concrete examples, it can run the gamut from, you sell the land or lease the land to us, and maybe we help you build something for your congregation or for the community, to partnering. There's really a spectrum, and I'm so happy to hear that there are resources, technical advisors available to you now to help you kind of think through those options.
Great, thank you. Carly.
Hi,
Tell
everyone.
us about yourself.
Thank you.
Organization.
Oh, and you can all hear me. I can hear myself. My name's Carly Grobe. I'm a principal planner at the San Francisco Planning Department, and I'm on the housing implementation team. And so my role is to organize the necessary staff to help your faith-based organization make it through the planning process. And I think many of you have heard scary stories about the San Francisco planning process. I'm here to help you. So my role in part is to help affordable housing producers, faith-based organizations in particular, try to navigate our process not only locally, we have our local planning code and a set of regulations that around housing development, but also how some recent state legislation that happens every year. We get a whole new suite of rules and a whole new set of tools that we can use to help make your projects go faster and work through the planning process in a much more expeditious way than we used to be able to. So, I also have some slides we can go through at some point, but we have really tried to assemble a team that can help you evaluate your site, the basic density of your site. What are the tools available to you in terms of perhaps increasing that density, perhaps going through the process in a more ministerial fashion, which means expedited, no environmental review. And then also working with our partners at the Mayor's Office of Housing, other city agencies, to make sure that we have properly documented your affordability and your land use restrictions, and making sure that all of that is in place so that you're ready to take the next step into working to find financing, working to find other partners to get your building out of the ground.
Wonderful, wonderful. And we have our esteemed attorney, Diane, will tell us about yourself and your organization, company.
Okay. Yes, my name is Diane Jackson McLean. I'm a partner at the law firm of Goforth and Littman in Oakland. We do affordable housing. We have about 35 attorneys, and we do affordable housing and represent public agencies throughout the state of California. I have been doing affordable housing way too long, but I enjoy it. I have been actually done a lot. I'm one of the principal attorneys for the San Francisco Housing Authorities and did most of all the RAD projects here. But I also have been involved in the faith-based community in terms of developing housing with affiliates of churches, and really being able to work with the faith-based basically to really empower them to really retain the power that they have. Most of the time they have the land, which is the most important thing in a development, and to be able to keep control of that land. So I spent a lot of time really trying to really give them that kind of education, or really empower them to really keep that in terms of their legal documents. And as part of my interaction, we work with every development on the team. I don't know if you remember, but I called you one time. I work with the planning department. I work with the developers. We work with the financing team. We work with, just about anybody on the team, the architect, the construction contract. So You know, many times the project, you have a vision of what you want to occur, but there are many, many pieces. And one of your, I'm not trying to toot my horn, but you need to have an attorney to make sure to navigate all the different parties and also to make sure that your objectives, and I want to say that again, that your objectives are met in that whole development process. So that is one of the things that we have done, and I have really enjoyed, and that's why I have been in affordable housing for, I'm going to my age now, over 30 years. I have been an attorney for over 30 years. I was a city planner for 10 years prior to going to law school. So I have seen the whole spectrum. Now I'm really old. But I really enjoy this area, and that's why I have devoted my life to this kind of career. So.
And just as a testimony, she does a lot of our work. So we really appreciate her. Ramy, we have gone through with DCG, and we've retained them as our owner's rep. They've taken us through that process. We've made the decision as a congregation that we want to go ahead and move forward in developing a house, a property. And we are now at the point of selecting a nonprofit housing developer partner, a JV partner. Can you walk us through what that conversation would be with Mercy as an example?
So when you reach out to, like, say me, and then the flyer that I have somewhere in this room also provides contact information for Sister Amy Bailey, any of us, we would really like to hear about your goals and your vision, and just to build and reinforce on what has been previously said, you know, having priorities, I guess, for your goals or your vision, but also being flexible is incredibly important, because as you probably gather from the conversations we've had today, the real estate development process is incredibly complex and can be lengthy. We're not in full control of the funding environment all the time. So just knowing kind of what your North Star is and what's really critical is important, and we want to hear what that is. And we may ask kind of questions like, are you sure? Like, are you willing to let go of this? Or like, how flexible are you in this? Because, you know, we want to obviously develop what Lauren had called as the highest and best use. But we also, you know, we have to figure out like how to make sure we can run the property, manage the property economically, because our rents are capped, but our expenses are not sometimes, right? I mean, you've been reading about utilities and insurance prices skyrocketing for homeowners. Well, it's the case for apartment owners, including affordable housing owners as well. So we have to really look at the financials and kind of figure out like, how can we make this work? And that generally is the same for whoever you may talk to, but sometimes there might be some slight differences between the different affordable housing developers, depending on kind of how they're organized, or, you know, how present they are in your community, for example. So that it would be a little bit of an iterative conversation, I think. And so we want to know what your priorities are, what you would like to envision happen, what role do you want to play, and maybe you don't know that yet, and we can talk through like, okay, like, do you just want to like say, okay, please develop this, like we just want to, you know, have our mission achieved, or like we want to be part of the ownership, and being part of the ownership means like you're going to be involved in a lot of the discussions and processes. Can you staff that appropriately? Are you willing to take some risks for that? Because you can't get something for free, right? And you know, we as affordable housing owners have to provide financial guarantees to the lenders and investors that Caroline described in those slides. Like, we literally have to. So there's some financial risks, and so if you want some of the benefits, there might be some kind of risks that are involved as well. And that's, again, that's a discussion that we would have to try to clarify, you know, what makes sense for you.
One, as a follow-up, in the previous session, Lauren really accentuated the need for mission. So can you talk about mission alignment with the congregation, and how Mercy works with the faith-based organization in terms of making sure the mission for Mercy is aligning with their mission, or maybe you're at a crossroads?
Yeah, it's very. I think it's very complicated, honestly, because you all know how your organizations are set up. There's those conversations may happen at different levels within your org structure, right? At your parish, your leadership, but then you're part of a bigger religious structure that may have a lot of say in what happens, and so we can help provide some helpful conversations for you, or DCG can, for example, but it's really up to you. Like, you need to have those conversations within your stakeholder groups and to have the appropriate authority to be able to say, hey, Mercy Housing, this is really what we want, and we've kind of vetted it through our, all the layers that we've had to, so that we're not surprised later that someone goes, wait a minute, no, that's not what we want. So I think that would be really helpful, and it's iterative, it's not a one size fit all, but I just want to say that would be incredibly helpful and important for any group embarking on this to do.
Gotcha. So we've come to the point we have selected our nonprofit housing partner. We've made a decision that we're going to work with Mercy on our development. And now what we have to do is make sure that we have some legal paperwork that concretizes and that memorializes what we've discussed as an entity. So that's where we then would call in Diane. And so Diane, we would come to you and we say, Diane, we are XYZ entity, faith-based organization. We want to partner with Mercy. This is what we've discussed. Take us through then where you pick up and what you do for us as an attorney.
Well, I can say most of the time there's generally a faith-based organization as well as an experienced nonprofit. And so one of the things that we would probably, the initial thing that we would do is really determine if they have established their different goals and objectives. So that we can really memorialize. I think it was Lauren who said they need to be a memorandum of understanding before there's any kind of other document. But that memorandum of understanding basically defines the relationship between the experienced nonprofit and the church group. Most of the time, because I think because of the way that affordable housing occurs, most affordable housing needs some kind of public subsidy. And because of that, a church organization generally have to form an affiliate entity that is not a religious because of the separation of church and state. And so it's really, having those kind of conversations, and I think what Raven was indicating, making sure that on the church side, that the authority has been delegated, or there is a clear line of authority in terms of what the church members or the people who are speaking on behalf of the church have the authority to do. Because the transactional cost can be very expensive, so you don't want to have conversations and the principal who's representing the church has no power. Then you've just wasted a whole bunch of time. So it's important, I think, even before you meet with the Mercies, that the church itself have a kind of brainstorming session to really identify what they want to accomplish, what kind of housing. Initially, maybe they want to do family housing, but then they decide, no, I want to do senior housing, or I want to do a mixture. But really to be able to have that kind of objectives in terms of what they want to achieve. And also, this is my bias. I don't like churches giving their authorities completely to nonprofits, so I would never just say, you do it. But I'm an advisor. I can't tell them what to do, but that's just my bias. But really be able to explain to the church what are the parameters of this affordable housing, and also to really kind of go through the process. I think you got a kind of flavor of some of the presentations that this is not a quick process. So you really do have to have patience, and you have to have people who are involved in the development process, who are representing the church, who has the patience to be able to stay with it through the end. It is not going to happen overnight. I mean,
it's
yeah. Okay, so it's not going to happen overnight. So that is, one of the things. But the bottom. Can you hear me now? Okay. The bottom result is that we end with an agreement that outlines the responsibilities between the parties. We also enter to the agreement that basically says who has the authority to make decisions, which decisions have to be made jointly, which ones can be delegated, what happened if you start to fight. It really kind of tried to anticipate all of the things that will happen to make that marriage work. And so that's a document that your lenders will actually, when they're going to give you a pre-development loan, they want to be able to see that kind of written agreement between the two. So it basically is a memorandum of understanding between the experienced developer and the church affiliate entity.
As a follow-up, 3 documents that we've heard in the conversation. One is an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding. Second, the second document that not document, but entity, which is a separate nonprofit. That's a separate nonprofit. And then the third is the actual partnership agreement. So Diane, can you really just kind of take us through a thumbnail of each of those and how you work with the various parties in order to arrive at those?
So the initial, to be able to have a memorandum of understanding, and that is an agreement that's going to be between 2 legal entities. And so most of the time corporations, and most of the churches are usually a religious corporation. That means that they would have to have had a board meeting authorizing the entry into that agreement. So that would be the first step. So that would mean that both the nonprofit entity as well as the faith affiliate entity would have had to have a board meeting to get authority to even begin the negotiations. And then once that gives you the authority to actually draft the document, and many times that document has to go back to that governing board to approve it. So that in that memorandum of understanding, there is generally a discussion in terms of who will be the ultimate owner. And I know that you heard earlier in the discussion about tax credits and taxes and bonds and that kind of structure. That kind of structure only works in what we have is called a California limited partnership or a limited partnership. And most of the times in a limited partnership, you have what is known as a general partner and a limited partner. And the general partner is generally the actual developer. And so that would be identified in the memorandum of understanding, and to be able to get that kind of approval to form that. The church organization would basically be an entity that is affiliated with the church. And most of the times you want to make sure, and this is where I have seen problems with church faith-based organization, is that you would have to form a corporation, usually a nonprofit corporation, which would have a board of directors. And you want to make sure that your board of directors, that you keep control over them. Otherwise, after their term gets out, anybody can come in. And that is what has happened, is people don't pay attention to the bylaws, and you think that the church is in control, but your bylaws does not have that kind of criteria. And that's where your legal counsel would give you advice in terms of making sure that usually the affiliate of the church, that the majority of the board are somehow affiliated with the church, and that's the way the control stands. So those are the things that would happen. And the reason why, there's 2 reasons. We form an affiliate entity so that, one, you can actually be part of the ownership entity, and eventually we get a 501c3 exemption so that you can actually be, so that you would be eligible for the real property tax exemption in the limited partner structure. But initially, in the memorandum of understanding, we would identify both the affiliate entity as well as the partnership entity. And I know that that's a lot, but these are the terms, if you're going to do affordable housing, that you would keep hearing over and over and over again, and that is the purpose. It's really the limited partner structure is a structure that is required in connection with tax credits. And that is because under tax credit structure, the investor is able to take advantage of the tax credit, and they are the limited partner. And the nonprofit developers who are tax exempt do not need a taxes, they don't need to get taxes because they're tax exempt. And under California law, there is a mechanism where if you are exempt under the 501c3, you are eligible to get a real property welfare exemption. So that's how that structure works.
And just to, I know we've thrown around that term tax credits, and then someone earlier talked about 4% and 9%, and I mean, that's just, what does all that really mean? And Diane just mentioned about the investor being the limited partner that buys the tax credits. The tax credit is the vehicle in order to get the funding in order to build your development. And so an investor, a bank, I think someone said earlier, a bank could come in and buy the tax credits. You don't need it because you're a nonprofit. So with that, Ramey, and I'm coming to you, Carly, I haven't forgot about you. So Ramey, we've met with Diane. And she's provided us advice and recommendations and a draft. Talk to us now about how many machinations do we have to go through with Mercy in order to get this thing to be now memorialized.
Oh, you're talking about the MOU?
Yeah, well, MOU, and then ultimately from the MOU
What
then
happens
to
next?
the
Yeah.
partnership agreement.
Well, I mean, obviously, we would want to make sure that we're in agreement with kind of what your proposed MOU is in terms of how we work together. And, I really liked how Lauren said earlier, like, this has to be a cultural fit. Like, this has to be a good relationship because we're going to be working together quite a bit and probably for quite a while, either through the development process, which could take a number of years, but also, what you are helping to create, whatever role you're going to play, is going to last for a very long time, right? Like, this is hopefully forever. This is long-term affordable housing that's going to serve your neighborhood and your community. So we want to make sure that that MOU looks good. We can always amend it as we learn more about each other. I just want to make sure that that's clear. We're allowed to change things. And then what we would want to do is either build on the work that you may have already done with DCG or others to figure out roughly, how many affordable families can we house, or seniors, or, because there's, to go back to what we said earlier, this funding that we have to get, which is local, state, and federal funding, public funding that is specifically for affordable housing. It's highly competitive, but it's also this whole analysis that we do. Okay, so we're in this kind of census tract, and so the best type of funding that we can get to build housing is, for this type of population. So we can help with that analysis at Mercy Housing if you haven't already done that, or we'll kind of add to what has already been done, for example, and then we would look at who are the service providers in the community that we can bring in. So let's say it's really important for your congregation to provide what's called supportive housing, permanent supportive housing for those who are unhoused. They need services to make sure that they stay housed and that they kind of build on their goals, whatever those goals might be. And so we need to make sure that we can find the right service partners in the community to help with that. So those are the kinds of things that we would look at, and how do we operate or properly manage the property. What are the approvals processes? You'll hear more from the planning department here about San Francisco, but there's different processes that we would have to evaluate depending on which city or county you're in.
Great. There are a couple things, just real quickly. Talk to us about the idea or the notion of trying to help the church or the community faith-based organization recognize the type of housing that is appropriate, because I think, and that's part one, and then part two is, many congregations, especially in urban communities, want to build housing, and for a faith-based organization, we want to build housing for our members, right? I mean, let's just be real. We want to build housing for our members. And so talk about how that may or may not be possible.
Yeah, so because we are using public funding, and there's honestly, there's no other way, we have to use public funding to build whatever affordable housing we create with you. We are required to do pretty broad marketing outreach to make sure that diverse communities have access to the opportunity to apply for this housing. We get thousands of applications, literally thousands of applications for every apartment that is available. The demand is so high. So, the government agencies want to make sure that our processes are fair and equitable. And so, unfortunately, we cannot say, hey, we're going to house, your congregant members and still be able to use that public funding. So what we can do in some situations, like in San Francisco has a neighborhood preference policy. So certain percentage of, let's say we build 100 units with you. I'm forgetting the preference, but I think it's like, let's call it 25. 25% of the units of that 100 unit building could be kind of slotted for people who live in the immediate neighborhood. And that's an official San Francisco policy. And there are probably other jurisdictions that have similar kinds of what's called preferences. So there are things like that, but unfortunately we cannot, set aside units for specific people.
Yeah. And that's very important for churches to understand, because we really want to build housing to try to keep our members that are in the community, in our community, especially when we think about the church, when we think about churches and the mass exodus of people from our community. And so it's just really important that you understand you just cannot build using subsidized dollars and want it just be for your members. There are some strategies, and Remy gave us one of them in terms of geographically. I don't know, does San Francisco, Carly, have a displacement, i.e., if you were displaced out of the community and you want to come back to the community, there are certain municipalities that have some preferences there. Does San Francisco offer that?
I believe they do, yeah. It's project-based, I think. That's a good question for the Mayor's Office of Housing. They would orchestrate that.
So that's something else to consider. If you have folks that were in your community that got displaced and want to come back, there's some preferences that might be available for those individuals also. We're going to hear from Carly, because we're at the point now. Well, we're at the point now. We've executed a MOU with Mercy Housing at this point, and now what we're ready to do is really get into how can we really get this thing built at this point. Now I'm fast tracking. We've already lined up some of the money. We don't have it all yet. We've lined up some of the money, but Carly and her team is absolutely critical to this whole process. And so what I love about what she said in her introduction is that a liaison, or she pulls them all together. And listen, you need somebody on the inside to help pull people all together at the city and county level. So Carly is going to take us through that part, and I know she has a presentation.
I do. Yeah, if we want to start the slides, that would be awesome. I'm Carly. I work on the housing implementation team. I also wanted to introduce two of my colleagues. Julian Vinales is here. He is our kind of formal liaison to this group, and then my colleague, Ada Tan. We can go to the next slide. So what does the planning department do? Just a high level. We do a lot. We look at citywide strategies for rezoning. We think about the what we want our city to look like. We definitely have staff who are big thinkers. And then we have staff that are looking at project by project, lot by lot projects, these small development projects that could be as minor as an addition to your home. So we are a lot of scales, and we work on land use and building form. So what do you want to use your property for? And how big can it be? Among many other things, the other one I really want to highlight in this presentation is environmental review. And so all of our permits in the city are covered by the California Environmental Quality Act. It's called CEQA. So that is the acronym is CEQA. And so we'll get into why CEQA kind of matters and doesn't matter in a moment. So maybe we can go on to the next slide. I just want to make sure I'm on the right page. So one note about the planning process as I'm going to talk about it is really we're the first step in your schematic development review. Our review happens before you submit a permit to start construction. So the planning department review will be completed before you start thinking about all the technical details that you need to include in a permit submittal. That would be primarily reviewed by the Department of Building Inspection. So they've got the engineers, the electricians, the plumbers to make sure all of that is in the right place. And we're thinking kind of bigger picture on how many people, how many units you want to build, well, how big is your building, what does it look like as it's situated on the lot. So maybe we could go to the next slide, please. I mentioned that the planning department review was a little scary. I think it has a bad reputation, to say the least. Up until about 5 or 6 years ago, the planning process was an arduous process. We didn't have a really big distinction in how we processed 100% affordable projects versus market rate or mixed income housing projects. By virtue of our city charter, all of our permits and projects in the city are subject to discretionary review by the Planning Commission. And when you bring in more review bodies, you add time to the process, you add subjectivity and uncertainty to the process, and you add the ability to appeal a project. And it's a lot more of an unknown, and that makes development a lot harder and a lot more time consuming. And that time also carries with it development costs. So the other piece of that was CEQA review or environmental review. So depending on how big your project is, where you were building it, what the potential environmental impacts were, your CEQA review could take a significant amount of time. And CEQA is not just what am I digging out of the ground, it is shadow and wind impacts and impacts to historic resources. It's a lot of broad topics. And again, these all require consultant reports. These require individual expertise to look at each of these impacts. So if we could go to the next slide, please. We have had a lot of local and state, we've made a lot of progress both at the local level and at the state level to make sure that we're streamlining especially 100% affordable housing. I'm going to mainly speak today about a couple of state level interventions that have been crucial for the planning department to expedite these really important projects. And I think we can all sort of agree that this is 100% affordable projects are a major public benefit that we want to prioritize. And so, while the commission retains their authority on some of the hairier, policy questions that we face on a day-to-day basis, these state programs have really helped us to streamline housing development. I will also note that part of our team's work is to also monitor how all of these programs fit together. So I'm going to kind of talk two big broad strokes. One is process and one is kind of code compliance. But we also have a number of local programs that we can plug in when we need to make all of these things as work as optimally as possible. So one of the state has basically done a couple things for us. It has provided opportunities for ministerial approval. And what that means is that the project is no longer subject to the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. It does have to meet some baseline environmental standards, like it can't be located on a wetland or in a high fire severity zone, but in San Francisco, we usually meet that pretty easily. The ministerial project cannot be analyzed under subjective criteria. We can only apply objective criteria to the project, which removes a lot of that uncertainty from the review process. And the planning department has to review the project within a certain amount of time. So usually it's between 90 and 180 days based on the project size. they'll leave 4 ministerial programs that we are commonly using. I can talk about one that I think is really exciting for faith-based organizations in a moment. But one of the other big tools that we use is the state density bonus law. And what that does is it gives you extra density, so more units and more developable floor area in exchange for affordable housing, and you're doing affordable housing. It also gives you waivers from development standards as well as incentives to reduce project costs. So when we're thinking about the zoned capacity of a site, you may be in a zoning district that only lets you build up to 40 feet. But the state density bonus law, especially as it exists to support affordable housing, may let you build up to 70 feet. And it may completely remove the density controls for that lot. So instead of being limited to 20 units, they're going to say, hey, you can build to 70 feet and just fit however many in the box that you can fit, which is really helpful, I think, in making your overall development costs stretch a little bit further. If we could just maybe go to the next slide. I did want to touch briefly on SB4. SB4 just passed. It became effective January 1st. It's been in effect for about 2.5 weeks, which is super exciting. And so SB4 is a ministerial streamlining program available for 100% affordable projects on land that has been owned by faith-based organizations. There are a couple different eligibility criteria. Proximity to freeways would require certain filtration. There's a limitation on how close you can be to certain industrial uses. Your affordability can be broken out to serve about 5% can serve staff of your faith-based organizations as long as they qualify for that affordable housing. So it's a really exciting possibility and tool in our toolkit that we can use to perhaps streamline the development of these different projects that you're considering. I do want to note that it is exciting to have this really specific program, but that doesn't mean that the other programs that we have at our disposal may not work better for what you're doing. So if SB4 doesn't work, if you can't meet one of the eligibility criteria, then we have a suite of other ministerial streamlining options that may be available. And I think Ramey actually, can we go to the next slide, please? Ramey actually touched on this, and I think you reiterated it. Affordability has a really, it's very helpful to understand what the project goals are, and it's very helpful to understand that as part of the planning process, we will be working with you to make sure that the affordability requirements are recorded on your deed and that you've entered into an agreement with the city that basically says, we're providing 100% affordable housing at these various income levels, serving these various populations, and in exchange, we got a big density bonus, we got fast approval, and part of my job is also to connect you with the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development, because as Ramey was kind of mentioning is, we as the city also have a stake in making sure that the affordable housing that you're providing is made available in a fair way. So having that information ready to come to us and say, we want to build senior housing, we want to build family housing, we're using this kind of scheme is really helpful for us, because then we can also move you through the regulatory process around who's monitoring that affordable housing, and then also we can get you through the permitting process, hopefully with as few headaches as possible. So yeah, that's the gist.
Carly was talking about this ministerial 90 to 120 days. What she was really talking about is SB 35, which was a bill at the state level to encourage municipalities in order to get your application through in 90 to 120 days. And I don't know about San Francisco, but I don't know that we've ever met the 90 to 120 days.
We have. We've
Really?
met it almost every time, yes. But until now, it's only a small set of projects.
Right.
Starting next year, it's going to be a much bigger set of projects. So it's I know. And that's part of my team is we are very, I don't know, Ramey can back me up. We really we take those deadlines very seriously.
So Diane, we have the application.
Are you working?
I think
okay.
we have our application in with the city, and we're working with Julian and with Carly's team, and we're running into roadblocks. I mean, you know, there's individuals that are subjectively imposing requirements, things like that. How do you, as the legal representative for us, help us through that navigation?
We just raise our hands up. No.
She calls me, she's like, listen.
I wanted to kind of step back and really talk about the development team, because I think it's so important. And I think there was a little discussion about that before. But you basically have a project manager you would decide who the project manager is. You have a financial consultant that's representing you, the developer. You have lawyers. You have both a real estate a lawyer, and also you usually have a tax attorney, real estate attorney. You also have an architect and a general contractor. And I wanted to go through that because many times, it's like what Carly was describing, that in the process of development, you have multiple phases, multiple aspects of development happen concurrently. What Carly was describing was the entitlement process. Mm-hmm. In terms of getting the government approval, anybody who does development has to go through the entitlement process to get the government approval for that project. Concurrently with that, you have the lenders. The city's MO department is also a lender. Sometimes they talk to each other, and sometimes they don't. So you would be good at making sure they talk to each other. But you also they have a process for applying for funds. Your city, and they have an RFP, a NOFA, where you have to apply for funds. And also the state has programs that you have to apply. So all that happens concurrently. When there are roadblocks in terms of your design and the city requirements, most of the time your architect, particularly if it's a local architect, they are familiar with the city's requirements and can assist you in walking through that. And so that's generally between the architect and the project managers. Sometimes the attorneys are involved, but many times the architect really does know what the requirements are. We do stay up with the new laws because there's generally a new law that comes out every year in terms of housing, but also the architect also is familiar with that. So that team would be working to really kind of facilitate that. But also because affordable housing, even though it has a great, it has everybody likes affordable housing, as long as it's not in their neighborhood. And so you do have the community opposition, and that's where the faith-based organization can be very helpful. It's really being able to because many times it's based on misinformation of what people think affordable housing is, and really being able to engage the surrounding community, and that is where it's less sometimes effective to use professionals and more effective to use the people who really have roots in the community. So that's where the team approach would be beneficial. So I think there's not one way to do it. I do think you do have to have a good team, but also you have to have a mechanism for community engagement. And it's important that a community engagement doesn't come from a place for telling the community what you want or what you're going to put in their community. They really do have to have a stake to really be able to see how overall this is going to benefit not only the people who are living in the affordable housing, but also the entire community. Yeah.
Ramy, add to this conversation real quickly about how does Mercy work with the nonprofit community-based entity and managing their frustration level, because all they hear is the city didn't approve it. That's all they hear. So how do you manage that? And then I want you to then dovetail into what Diane was just talking about, the community engagement process, and how do you work with the nonprofit to do that?
Oh, how to manage the frustration level. So first of all, I want to make sure this is crystal clear that we keep saying you will do this, you will do that, and I just want to make sure it's clear that you understand that that's actually what my job is. And when Diane mentioned the project manager, that would be someone on my staff that would be hiring the architect and hiring all these professionals and figuring out how to work with Carly and her colleagues on getting all the approvals. This is not something that you literally need to do. It's more, I think we're just trying to make sure you understand kind of what's involved so that when we talk to you about it, you're like, okay, I kind of remember what that means, but can you say that again? Can you describe that to me again? And we totally know that this is a very foreign process. There's a lot of vocabulary that is, we're gonna throw at you. So you just make sure you ask good questions, right? So that's part of the frustration level too. And we're frustrated. I mean, we keep talking about the insufficient public funding resources, and I do want to talk about that, put a plug for that at, maybe towards the end. But so it is hard. This is hard work. But didn't we all sign up for hard? Like you were in this room, right? Because you signed up for hard. You may not want to do this ultimately, I don't know, but the work that you're doing at your congregations, at your churches, at your parishes, I know you're doing hard. So I think, we'll just have to muddle through it and kind of commiserate with each other. And, there's going to be obstacles, no doubt about that. But again, I think we're all kind of used to that, right? So.
Absolutely. Carly, when you're getting all of your team is fielding all of these questions, possibilities, right? And how does you and your team manage the unrealistic expectations sometime of some faith-based organizations?
Well, I think that this goes, no, that's a great question. Honestly, part of my job is expectation management, it's okay. I think that's one of the things is we have made a really big effort at the planning department and in the city to really make ourselves available for 100% affordable projects. And the, folks who are taking them on, not only because, they may be faith-based organizations who've never done this before, but also it's a lot more complicated than maybe a market rate project can be. You're getting in tax credits, you're bringing in MoCD, you've got everybody and their mother involved. So, we really do try to be available to hold your hand through the process. But, part of this expectation setting is also us being really honest about the limitations of what we can do. And, I think when we talk about goals, when we talk about vision, when we talk about mission, it's really helpful to have your project manager in the room and also, sometimes a representative from the faith-based organization. I think it's really helpful to have a Diane and an architect and a Ramey in the room so that we can have a conversation about how do we reach each of these goals and where do we have to make compromises? And also, we are also working hard to stretch how far these programs can go. And I think, if I tell Diane, we're going to interpret the state law more liberally in this case, is your client comfortable kind of taking on that risk and making sure that, are we all okay with that? Because it's not me who is taking that risk. I'm going to say, we could look at it this way, but I want you to be kind of up to speed and well-informed about what are your trade-offs, what are you thinking? We definitely have communities that don't want affordable housing in their neighborhoods or in their backyards. And so how does that, how do we think that is something that is supportable and strong to stand on, or are we going to be challenged on some of these things? So we're all in kind of new territory, and I think we're really trying to be as liberal as possible when we're thinking about housing development, but we also want to be realistic in these conversations we have with you. And I'm really happy you mentioned too about the constituency living in these buildings, because that's a big one. We want to build for our congregation because they are having a hard time staying here, and that can be sort of a non-starter. And so I appreciate that we're all here to have an honest conversation with each other with kind of a big main goal at the end.
Diane, there is, as you know better than any of us, a lot of ambiguities in some laws and some rules. And Carly, she alluded to this. How do you help to kind of steer the ship in a way that makes the eyes that need to approve it look at it at the way that it needs to be looked at in order to go forward?
I mean, I think it is a discussion that, basically having a discussion with the people who actually are going to be implementing or responsible, who have jurisdiction over determining if you're complying with the law. And many times we actually do try to draft documents so that we actually indicate our reasoning of why we think the way that we are applying it is applicable. We have understood and we have this experience. The law is an art, and many times a regulator will impose regulations or requirements that has no basis in law, but just is based on what they think it is. And I think you need to have an attorney that would challenge that. Relationships are important. We take great pride in not really upsetting the people who provide the financing for these projects. So it's kind of an art to be able to really articulate, to really, really make sure that the objectives of the funding is being made, but at the same time, the client is being protected in terms of what the law says. And we make sure, for example, we know that many people who don't like affordable housing is going to challenge it based on a CEQA challenge. And so in our documents, we make sure that we incorporate all of the CEQA findings in the document itself. So if we have to go to court, we have a record that basically say that we are complying with all of the findings that Carly's department has imposed on the project. So you really do have to finesse. It's unlike litigation. In these kind of transactions, we actually are trying to reach the objective of having affordable housing at the end. So we try to minimize the risk at the same time meeting the objectives of all of the various parties. The thing about affordable housing is that you have so many different players. Not only you have the entitlements in the city, but once we start to get before the, just before the construction closing, you're going to have all of the lenders, their underwriting staff, as well as all of their attorneys. Now, it's not expected for the faith-based organizations, as Remy said, to understand that, but you need to have people in place, your attorneys, your project manager, your financial consultant, that can go toe-to-toe with the professionals on the lender side, that can protect your interests. That's the key. Many times, I've seen where someone will rely on some numbers that are being projected, but those are the lender's consultant. And I tell you, they are not looking at your interest. You need to have your own consultant to really evaluate those numbers. So as long as you have people on your team that you trust, and I do say you have to be able to trust them, then you're able to really get a development happening. So I think that kind of thing and being able to delegate that and taking the time, I think someone said doing interviews for your team, I think that is very important. But once you select your team and you have a contact person, then you need to let them do their job and make this project happen.
Remy, we are at the point of one of the most competitive processes relative to housing development, which is that big old capital stack that Caroline was talking about earlier, right? And one of the things that we know about, and it has been said, is getting that money, getting the capital stack is very competitive. We've heard this. And we've heard that sometimes you have to go several rounds in order to get it. Talk to us about how Mercy writes these award-winning grant applications, tax credit applications, where where you're able to squeeze every eighth of a point. That makes a big difference, right? So talk to us about that, because that's a big deal. And sometimes it takes the longest in the development process. So talk to us and take us through that.
Yeah, it's I'll just briefly describe. It's really a competition. Like, it's kind of like elite sports. And we have like for state funding that is pretty critical for us to any development to proceed to construction. We have one round every year. So if you don't get an award that round, you got to wait a whole nother year to apply again. So it's just really because there's insufficient public resources. So I'm going to put my plug in. You've heard several times today people talk about, hey, there's a San Francisco bond on the ballot, there's a regional bond on the ballot, there's a state bond on the ballot. 2024 is turning out to be a pivotal year. Oh, look at that. A pivotal year for voters. Voters are going to be asked at least 3 times, maybe 4 if you count the behavioral health bond that's also on the March ballot, to basically vote yes. I say vote yes on all of these bonds that are on the ballot, because they're basically dedicated to providing that public funding that we all need. Whether you are going to proceed with your development or not, your community needs this funding to come to be approved by voters and to come down to the localities so that the collective we have funding to be able to use to develop the affordable housing for our low-income seniors and families and people with special needs. So I want to make sure that that's super crystal clear, and we will need you and all of your congregations' help to get the word out about this and how important it is and how important it is for your communities that this funding is actually approved. It is very difficult. We need 2/3 vote in San Francisco for Prop A, which is the sign that was held up. And you know how hard that is, right, to convince voters. So I just want to make sure that you pay attention and that you are able to figure out how to activate your members so that they vote yes and actually even come out to help campaign a little bit.
Last question, then we'll open up for you, Carly. One of the requirements for tax credits is local participation. In order to get those dollars, we have to have local dollars. Talk to us about how your team helps us get those local dollars so that we can compete at the state level.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we have a partnership, the San Francisco Planning Department. My role in the planning department is really to be a liaison to the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development. And so through various funding sources, some of it is development impact fees, they are a lender. They may make funding available for projects through NOFAs, RFPs, so on and so forth. And so, whether or not a faith-based organization is awarded funding, or whether it's a, MoCD just is regulating units, there's a really critical partnership between the faith-based organization and the city to kind of maintain that, maintain affordability for the life of the project. So especially when there is public participation and more public funding available, MoCD has an opportunity to serve a broader range of projects. And so part of my job is to put you in touch with the right person, essentially, at MoCD, and to help you to transition from, your entitlements package and your sort of big schematic picture into the nitty-gritty around how can the city support you in as you assemble your capital stack, and how can, what resources are available at at this moment when you're planning to kind of pull your financing together. And, sometimes it's kind of like the focus is on family housing, but you want to build senior housing. So they can also help you strategize around timing and, what's the best way to kind of go about this, and who else is in the pool, who else is in the competition? Who are you playing against? Are you playing against Michael Phelps? Who are we talking about? And so they have a really good finger on the pulse about the citywide development and the kind of race that you're entering, so that you can kind of strategize about how to succeed, really.
Great. Questions right over here. Right.
Thank you all. My question is actually for Ms. Jackson McLean, a follow-up.
Okay.
Okay. If we have a situation where we're going to build in San Francisco, we're going to tear down the church and build housing, but the church still wants to worship on site and in the building. And most affordable housing projects will build offices and a community room. And let's say the church wants to have 2 dedicated offices, and they want to use the community room for worship and other programs. So now you have a kind of church-state thing. Does the church, is the only way for them to do a 501c3 to get around that, to be allowed that? Also, the Mayor's Office of Housing in San Francisco checks who you're renting to also.
Yeah.
So this would probably be a rental situation. So just curious of how that works.
I mean, I think that is a dilemma. I think that I have experienced with some of my faith-based organizations because they want to basically do housing, but they also want to have church services. And so I have been involved in projects that have done it 2 ways. One has been where they actually have subdivided the property and created a, legally with a parcel map,
Yep.
and created one just for housing, and one for the church service. The dilemma with that is the church service has to get their own financing to actually do the construction for the church because you can't use public funds. The other way that it probably won't address all your needs, but is that we basically do a project where you have a community room that can be used for church services, but it has to be available to the general public. You can't designate it and say, on Sundays, we got it. No, it has to be, general rules for the general public to be used. And that may or may not be your objectives because most times church want to have a dedicated time. So that is the only 2 alternatives that you have in terms of having a community room that is available to the general public, where there are general rules that any community service organization can apply. You can't discriminate against, and say, well, only our church can use it. It has to be open to the general public. So that's the dilemma that we have. So there's basically being able to, sometimes we're kind of doing a project now where they're actually going to do they decided that they actually do want a church, and so they're doing a lot split. And then they're going to have basically easements going back and forth, but it would be 2 separate projects. So that's the challenge, is getting the financing for the church part of that project.
Court, let me just follow up because I want to ask this and just came to me. What about the possibility of condominiumizing the church, the church space? And then it gets to, Court, your question.
So the condominium, the condominium is another term for parcel map. It's basically, instead of going flat, you're going up.
Yes.
And so that's basically, you are able in California and in San Francisco, you can do what is air rights parcels.
That's right. Yeah.
And so that those are legal parcels, and you still would have, to be able to have the church as a separate legal parcel, you still would have to have non-public financing for the church part of it, but you could do proportional share in terms of the cost. There are some tax credit issues with that. I'm not a tax attorney, but my tax attorneys always tell me, I always have to talk to them when we use that structure because there's some issues with the basis, and that's as far as I can know about tax. But you can't do it that's another way that it's done. And we actually are exploring that because that is, many times churches have this land, but they still want their service there. So basically, how can you create a legal parcel? They create a legal parcel and their easements where they may share the parking. And then that's part of the development. So you have basically a mixed-use development where the church is one part of the development and the residential is the second part of it.
There's a situation where you might have a building you want to remain, and we want the developers to fix it up, but it has the sanctuary in it as a part of a bigger building. So then you just kind of get splitting hairs of how we can make the development team pay for the majority. Say you have to do a seismic upgrade of that.
Yeah, I think that's a dilemma because you can't use public funds for religious. That's what the distinction is. And so it's really basically trying to, you basically have to do a condo or to kind of subdivide it. Yeah.
Question over here.
Our property is about half a mile from the coast, and there's nothing between us and the coast. Can one of you speak to, or however many of you want to speak to, how the Coastal Commission is going to complicate our lives?
That's a whole nother one.
The California Coastal Commission?
Yeah, how they're half a mile from the coast.
Oh.
And
That is.
You know, I think one of the issues is that, you know, the certain government entities, and that's a good question, because certain government entities have jurisdiction over certain types of land.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there was mention to get a preliminary report. It is called a preliminary report, and basically a preliminary report is basically a commitment to provide title insurance. But what that preliminary report will show you is all the restrictions that are on the property. And also it will show you all of the restrictions that are recorded. And so initially, you want to have, usually when you get that preliminary report, your attorney will pull all those recorded documents to see what the restrictions are. And the Coastal Commission has its own requirements, similar to the city has its entitlement process. And so you would have to do both the city's process as well as the Coastal Commission. And many times they can work together, but sometimes they can't. The Coastal Commission may have restrictions that are more stringent than the city. And so you would have to meet both of them. And even if you met the city's requirements, but you couldn't meet the coastal, you could not do that development. Yeah.
Ramy, any experience with that?
Oh, I was going to add to what Diane said, that, you know, if you came to us, I was like, we got to call our land use attorney, you know, who could look at what those Coastal Commission kind of jurisdictions are, and specifically for your site too, because your site may have zoning on it and the city may have a plan that allows you to have a more expedited process with the commission. So
There are, I'll add just briefly, I agree, we'd have to look at the site and kind of understand what was going on, but some of the the emerging state laws are also becoming more detailed about the intersection of local zoning and the Coastal Commission, and when projects may be allowed in coastal zones and when they may be prohibited completely. So I think as you're moving forward into 2024, 2025, it's definitely helpful to check in with the land use attorney and with the city kind of what the rules are, because I think with SB 35, it used to be that coastal zone development was completely prohibited, and now starting in 2025, there's going to be some nuance there. So it changes year to year, so just keep on track.
All right, question in the back.
Yeah, I wanted to know, when does DCG drop out of the process, or do they stay throughout the entire process? Do they drop out after the MOU or the partnership agreement? At what point?
I'm not with DCG, but I can answer that, and Lauren is in the back. DCG stays with you all the way through the development process, all the way through construction. There was one question up front here.
Those of us old enough to remember Phil Donahue. It's for Carly. Have you done, I won't hold you to it, and I'm assuming if you've done it, it's even anecdotal, but have you done any studies of what sort of increases in volume, ultimately in units, that you anticipate as a consequence of SB5 specifically? I'm sorry, SB4.
SB4. So not directly of SB4. So I think you're kind of hitting on an interesting point, is we have ministerial streamlining programs, and SB4 sort of also brings in a nice density bonus on top of it. So some of these programs also sort of start to combine extra incentives along with process incentives. What we found in implementing SB4 in San Francisco is that our underlying zoning and some of the programs that we have already are going to exceed what the density bonuses are allowed in SB4. So we our toolkit is already sort of really well stocked to kind of go above what SB4 lets you do. but we could still use the streamlining benefits of SB4 as well. So I think we're really trying to puzzle some pieces together. Anecdotally, we also combine a lot of these ministerial streamlining programs with the state density bonus. And there is a section in the state density bonus that gives you unlimited density and 3 extra stories of height. And anecdotally, we've definitely seen projects, I think one is 730 Standing actually, where the underlying zoning was about 60 units and they're building about 200 units. So these are like increases of 100 to 200%, like huge, huge density increases. And so, you know, by combining those 2 tools, we also can use SB4 as ministerial streamlining. It's consistent, you know, it's state law plus state law. It marries really nicely together. And so that's what our focus has really been, is how can we achieve, and again, you don't have to maybe take the whole cake, but how can we make you the biggest cake and bake it for you the fastest? So, you know, I think that like, it is sometimes case by case though, because we still do have single family zoning in the city. We still have instances where there's super low density sites that are huge and ripe for development. So we usually just suggest like, come on in and we'll try to put the right puzzle together.
It still sounds to me though, like for church-based sites, that sounds at least like a double.
Yes, for sure. And that's something too, you know, SB4 sets the income levels very consistently with what's allowed in the state density bonus for the 100% affordable housing. And so the marriage of those 2 programs is super, super helpful. If we can't, for some reason, if that doesn't make sense, and that's becoming less and less frequent, you know, we also have local programs to increase your density right out of the gate. So there's a provision of the planning code that says you don't have a numerical density anymore. You just can build whatever you can build. What, you know, the envelope will let you form-based zoning, essentially. And, you know, then you can add a bonus on top of that. So there's a lot of ways, I think, that we can achieve significantly higher densities than what the base zoning contemplates. And that's really specific to 100% affordable housing. But it's definitely, you know, we try to look at, okay, where is the site? How big is the site? What is the site currently used for? Like, there's a huge benefit to having a parking lot under this, the Cars to Casas program. Single family zoning and duplex zoning also gets a pretty huge benefit under our local code that we try to combine with state law. So it is sometimes just trying to figure out what the most logical combination is for the site, and then what you want to build, obviously. Yeah.
All right, thank you so very much. Court, did you have one final question?
I'm Court. He's Jim.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
What power does neighbors have on the 100% affordable vote? Just protesting and CEQA?
Well, protesting is still available. CEQA, not as, you know, it just, you're not protesting in a public hearing anymore. But I think the benefit of a ministerial project is that CEQA goes out the door. You do not require CEQA, so the appeals options are limited. The appeals options to the Board of Supervisors are limited. The appeals options to the Board of Appeals are limited. You know, we're really looking at perhaps only one bite at the appeals apple. And then, I mean, unfortunately, the next step, I think, is litigation. Please correct me if that's incorrect, but, you know, is a lawsuit. But, you know, I think the other thing that's really nice about these programs is it's very black and white for us to say, yes, this is eligible for streamlining. Yes, this is, you know, we try to, in the same way that Diane's trying to keep a really clear record, we're trying to also keep a really clear record to say, this is how we used these 3 things in combination. We're okay to do that. And I think we've been really successful in the maybe 2 to 3 very contentious projects that we've seen in the last couple of years.
All right, we'll put you in the hands of DCG Strategies.
Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us again. Thank you to all of our wonderful speakers for being here and for lending your expertise to us. We are so thrilled to be able to share all this information. As I said in the beginning, we hoped to be able to provide a very, very, very high-level overview of the process. There's so much more to learn, and I hope you have just a taste of what the process could look like. But of course, if you have additional questions or need additional information, feel free to contact any of our speakers, as well as reach out to our team at DCG Strategies. A few things. Once again, I wanted to thank the San Francisco Interfaith Council for co-hosting today's event with us. I also, of course, wanted to thank San Francisco Foundation for sponsoring today's event, sponsoring our breakfast and our lunch. We truly appreciate your support. 2 additional reminders. As Megan shared, we have the pre-development analysis funding available. Please, please, please apply for it. We have money. Apply for that money. So go to our website, dcgstrategies.com, to submit your contact information to become eligible potentially for that. Then the second thing is we are also wanted to send a huge thank you to St. Mark's Lutheran Church for hosting us in this wonderful, beautiful space. As they shared in the very beginning, they actually have a development, 100 units, I believe. And Jeff Kohler right here, Jeff is hosting actually a tour of St. Mark's Square. If you are interested in participating in it, and the tour will happen right now in the next 5 minutes. It'll take about 15 to 20 minutes to tour the property, and there will be time for questions and answers as Jeff can best answer them to his ability. But that's all we have for today. Again, thank you so much for joining us. The last thing, I know I said that was the last thing. One more. As I said, today is the first conference of 2. We have our second conference. It will be hosted at Glad Tidings Community Development Corporation in Hayward, California. That will be on February 15th. So please help us spread the word if you know of East Bay congregations, or you are also welcome to attend again. Today's conversation we had focused with individuals focused in San Francisco. It'll be the same, similar, but just we'll have speakers and entities that are focused on the East Bay development. So please help us spread the word and feel free to join as well. Safe travels home. Thank you again.